I'm Sarah Shreves. I'm at the University of Arizona, I'm chairing this session. We've been doing this for a long time, stories of long-term sustainability. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. One is I want to remind everyone about the Ideas Challenge, and so if you haven't found a team or you're interested in a team, please talk to other people and form up a team. If you haven't been through the Ideas Challenge at Open Repositories, it's often hilarious and fun, and it's just a great community gathering around really interesting, innovative ideas, and it's a lot of fun. So I hope people will participate in that. We're going to have 3 presentations, each a half hour. So that's including room for questions. So we'll take the questions at the end of each presentation. Also, as a reminder, this session is being live streamed. So just keep that in mind if you have any hesitation about being live streamed. So to start us off, we have Christian Zimmerman from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So.
Thank you for coming so early. A few conferences ago, there was a rant session, and I was invited there to give a rant about sustainability. And the theme of this conference gives me the opportunity to expand on this and on what I had in mind when I gave this rant. So the context in which I'm working is that I'm working on a project that has been around for a long time. I wonder if there's any project being discussed here that's actually been around for longer than that. Next week, it's going to be 21 years old and ready to drink. And so I wanted to discuss a little bit how we did it to be able to continue on for such a long time, and what this could imply for your particular projects, the current or any future projects, if you think, and you should, about sustainability. So this presentation is on the web, so you can refer to it later. I've included some links so that if you're interested, you can follow up on additional things. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what Repick is, and along the way, drop a few hints about what is going to be important for sustainability. Then concretely discuss what made it sustainable, and then how it can apply to you and your project. So Redpack, that's an abbreviation of Research Papers in Economics. It was created in '97 with a mission to enhance the dissemination of research in economics through the democratization of the process for authors and readers. Basically, that was before even the people were really talking about open access. It's about open access. However, the big difference is that we are technically not a repository. We only host metadata, but the idea was to centralize all the metadata in one place, and that is important because in economics, like in some other social sciences, publication delays are very long. We have a preprint culture, and you need to find ways to disseminate those, right? Because if you miss on the preprints, you miss on the frontier of research. As I like to say, published articles are just a historical record in economics. So how did we do this? So basically, the metadata about all these publications, they are all housed on the publishers' websites. And by publisher, it's a very broad term that I use here. It is commercial publishers, but it is also university departments, research centers, policy institutions like mine, um, who host their papers, whichever way they used to host them, and the metadata in a particular format that we've defined in a particular location that we know of. Then anybody can come and use that data. So what we call RepX services are services that use this data to display it in one way or the other. The main services that are popular among economists are econ papers, ideas, and NEP. NEP is an email and RSS dissemination tool. The other two are websites that allow you to browse through the bibliography. Others that use Repick data, I mean, there's a ton, and I've seen here, just here, there are a couple that also use Repick data, because this is all metadata that's freely available, that is organized and everything. And beyond that, we do some enhancements. And in fact, some of those enhancements, we have been the first ones to do it, because we did it already 20 years ago. Like author registration, author ID, author profiles, citation analysis, replication wiki, linking preprints and articles, and many other things that we do with this data. So what did we do? So we started in '97. We had a precursor that was going on from '92 already. We have 2,000 participating archives. This is repositories that work with us. We just passed 2,000 a couple days ago. They are in 98 countries. Yesterday, Saudi Arabia joined. We have 53,000 authors, 2.6 million items, 3,000 journals, 100 million measured downloads. Not every service that uses Repick data sends us this kind of data, but this is for the 4 services that send us this data. And it's more and more used also for scholarly research to analyze how people publish, the state of the economics profession, and things like that. What are the resources that we got for this? Basically, almost nothing. We had some startup grants, really tiny grants along the way. I would say that over the 21 years of Redpack, we may have had grants for a total of a little over $100,000. So basically, we have done with almost no resources. We are mostly in maintenance mode now, right? Because we have introduced already so many features, right? And to be fair, founders are not interested in funding maintenance, right? They're interested in funding new stuff, right? So we know that, I mean, we don't even bother applying for funds. We know we're never going to get any. We have some costs. We have no revenue because we don't charge for anything. We have some costs. So hosting is a cost. It's not expensive, and we have sponsors for that. As an example, NEP, our email notification service, it costs $60 a month. It's easy to find a sponsor for that. But we rely a lot on volunteers, right? People who help us in many ways to run this. And how did we, and they're critical in making things sustainable. So how did we make it sustainable? We script as much as possible so as to minimize the human input necessary to run this. Basically, Redpack right now can run without any human intervention. There's a little bit of it. I mean, if a new archive joins, somebody needs to input that data, right? But it's minimal. We decentralize. Many people do little things. As you saw, for example, the metadata is not centralized at all. It's completely decentralized. Every publisher is in charge of its own metadata. We have volunteers, and we try to motivate or recognize them. One way to recognize them, for example, our email notification service, we have about 100 different mailing lists, each for different fields. There's an editor that needs to determine what goes into that. Well, the name of that editor is prominently displayed on every email that's sent out to his peers in his field, right? So that it gives name recognition, right, that they value much. The other thing is that every task has a reward, right? The most obvious one is for the publishers, right? They maintain the metadata. The reward is that their publications are read. You need, however, a core set of true believers, right? Who function without this kind of rewards. We have half a dozen people that have been with RepX since the start and who have invested quite a bit of time in that. I'm one of them, because we think it's just the right thing to do, right? And also, one thing that helps is that because many people recognize this is a great thing to do, that those core volunteers have also been recognized by their institutions that they provide a really important public service. And thus, for example, when I was faculty, my service component of my job was not to sit on silly committees, it was to take care of Repick, right? However, you need to be able to renew that core. We have been at it for 21 years. It's kind of a miracle that nobody died yet. But it's going to happen. So, and there we struggle a little bit on that one, right? We need to find, because we have the core team has been so involved that it's difficult for a newcomer to come in, right? So we need to work on that. One thing that was also important is that we need to provide additional value, right? If you run an institution repository, for example, just having lists of things displayed, right, or even profiles for the faculty is probably not going to be much of a motivator. You want more, something more. So figure out what can get people to be more interested. And we have done a few things. They don't necessarily apply to what you're doing, but we found that it was really useful in getting people motivated to participate. That is a little extra, right? That makes it that it's not necessarily very expensive to do, but that gives it much value. Also, we work within academia, and we all know that faculty have big egos. So this is what we have really played on within Repick when we started doing rankings. Because we have citation analysis, we have download numbers and so on. So we could start doing some rankings, also institutional rankings. That was interesting because then department head makes sure that everybody's in Repick, and then everybody's in Repick wants to make sure that all the publications are listed and so on. So yeah, you get that ball rolling. So that was really important. All in all, what we've done is to make sure that we motivate our volunteers, right? Because that's the resource we had, right? So make sure that they see the incentives that motivates them to participate or to push others to do what's necessary. Now, one interesting aspect of that is that this made that it became very clear to everyone that Redpack is for the community, right? Because it's driven by the community. The whole community participates in making Redpack run. And also that there is, given that there's no business model in terms of revenue, right? This makes basically that Redpack cannot be bought, right? And lately that has become really important. And this is an additional motivation for volunteers that is very clear, right? That the time that they put in for Repick is not going to be ultimately going to some corporate entity, right? That it's going to stay within the community. And sometimes people have suggested to me, so why don't you start having ads, or why don't you sell your website or something like that? And my reply has always been, that's going to just kill the project, right? Because volunteers are not going to be willing to enrich me, right? So volunteers are really important in all that. So how can all this apply to you and your project? So most of the time, right, your project is not going to be just relying on volunteers at docs, right? You're going to have some funding, right? So you want to, and we had some funding as well, but it was really concentrated in the very early years, because that's when we were innovating, right? That's when funders were interested, hey, you're doing something really new here, right? So when you have a project, think about it. Is my funding going to be sufficient to carry this project into the future? Right? You got X dollars, right? You are funded for 2 years. Okay, after 2 years, do you have a project that's going to be continuing on without funding? Or do you actually need funding to have it continue? I've seen too often projects that just die once funding runs out, and everything gets deleted like never anything happened, right? You want to think right from the start. So what's going to happen once the funding runs out? With Repick, right, we put things in place, right, so that we know that it's going to continue, right? Think about your project that way as well. That means also that, I mean, if funding runs out, right, I mean, this happens to everyone. I mean, even Oxiv, right, at some point funding ran out. Big crisis, right? And and your little project, right, funding may run out earlier than you think. And I want to encourage you to think about how volunteers may be interested in helping you out with the continuation of the project. If not just the start, just at least the continuation of it. And devise your project in a ways that volunteers see why they want to participate, what's in it for them, right? People are self-interested, right? So you have to think about what's in it for them. And if there are people who are known to be self-interested, it's really economists, right? And we have shown you we can do it, right? And this continuing of a project, it's quite difficult, in fact, because the continuation of a project is mostly about maintenance. And there's nothing sexy about maintenance, right? Reviewing logs, making sure that the data is correct, that things are still running well, right? Following up on people who don't do their stuff, right? It's not sexy, right? So so you need to find a way to make it sexy for somebody to be part of that project. When you start a project, you have a team, right? What happens if that team's, what's happening to that team once the funding runs out, right? Are they just going to disappear, or do they have some interest in I mean, not full-time, but on the side, right, to continuing on? And you, as a project leader, right, what happens if you leave the project? Can that project work without leadership? Repick never had any leadership. It's just whoever wants to contribute comes and does it, right? There is no president of Repick. There are some people like me who have more visibility, right? But I mean, I cannot prevent anybody from doing something with Repick. For your project, right, if you leave, right, for whatever reason, or you become disinterested, what's happening, right? So if any of you have a current project, and if you have trouble to answer any of those questions, find a way to answer that correctly. Because once your funding runs out, or once you're losing some resources, right, your project may not survive. And then all that work is for naught, right? All that sunk cost is sunk. So I hope that at least within the library community, that people, not just because of this presentation, but because of the theme of the whole conference, right, will think harder about sustainability, because there's a lot of good work that's done, but it's done in a poor way, right? In a way that is not sustainable. And it really breaks my heart, especially given the little funding that we had, when I see these big projects that gobble millions of dollars that last 2 years and then disappear. I could have done so much with that money, and it would continue on, right? And I want a better use of resources. That's what economics is about. Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. I was just looking quickly at the RepX website, and I had a couple of questions more about the how it operates. So it sounds like you're trying to get most of the publication information from the publishers, but you do also take them from individual authors or institutions. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then how do you assure or maintain your metadata quality, and then also in terms of a link to a preprint or a postprint, suppose the publisher links to their publisher's version that's behind a paywall, but another institution has a link to the same thing as a working paper that's freely available. How do you negotiate that?
Okay, so so we link to wherever the publication is. So it may be behind a paywall, so we cannot circumvent that, right? When there's a working paper version out there, so the way we function is that we have this author registration service, and people there recognize what is their work, And when we see the article and the working paper within the record of the same author, and it has a title that is close, we deem those to be different versions of each other, right? And then, for example, on the websites, we show, if you stumble on the article, there's a link, oh, there's another version out there, right? And vice versa. Yes. So the working paper version is coming from the relevant institution. We consider that also a publisher. So I can't read where you're from. So Virginia Tech has a Repick archive, and there it's probably the department secretary that maintains that, and she probably a she inputs that on their website, and we gather it every night and update the various websites.
Can you tell a bit more about who exactly your volunteers are and how do you find them and refresh them now and then?
So it all depends on what kind of, how you define volunteer, right? So I mentioned various times core volunteers. So this is a half dozen people who are very involved, who run the websites, who write the scripts and these kind of things. Then we have another layer. These are people who are a bit less involved, and particularly among them, I would mention our NEP editors, right? So basically, we have these mailing lists, and for example, if one volunteer says, "Okay, I've had enough, I want to move on," we just send a message to the mailing list, "Hey, we need a new editor." And typically, we have several candidates, and so we need just to figure out who's the next one. And then we have open invitations to open new fields, right? So anybody who thinks their field is not covered and wants to be an editor is welcome. Then the next layer, that's those who maintain the archives, right? So this is about 2,000 people, and they come to us, right? They say, hey, I want my publications listed. We point them to the instructions. They come back and said, we've done everything. We input them in the database, and there we go. And they just I forgot to answer these questions about metadata quality. So we rerun scripts that diagnose the metadata quality, and every month those maintainers get an email alerting them whether there is something that needs attention or not. It's all automatic.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation, especially about the seemingly non-existing governance model. You mentioned there is no leadership. There's just people who have a little bit more visibility than others. Can you elaborate a little bit how that works? Let's say I'm a new volunteer and I think your website looks like something from 1992 still, and I want to make the proposal to kind of make it responsive, or some of the, like, how do you deal with these things, or how do you do decision making? Is it like with a majority vote, or can you give some examples where this has worked very well, or some of the problems you had with this?
Well, so our typical answer would be, okay, you don't like our website, or I mean, this is actually a criticism I got for my website, that it looks like in the 90s, and it's true. And it's just at the beginning of this year I did a revamp. Now it's modern looking. But if you came to me with this, I mean, I would say, well, go to the maintainer of that particular website, and if you want to help him, do that, and just go ahead. Or just start your own website. We're fine with that, right? The mission is the enhanced dissemination, right? The more websites we have using Repick data, the better it is, right? So just go ahead.
All right. Well, let's thank Christian for his presentation. Next up, we have William Nixon from the University of Glasgow.
With me for a second. So, good morning, colleagues. It's day 2, and I am delighted to be here in Montana. So, from one big sky country to another, clearly our weather is always like this in Scotland. I'm here to, delighted to be part of this session around kind of stories about sustainability. So, I want to talk a little bit about it from an institutional point of view and from my own institution's point of view from the University of Glasgow. I've got 4 broad themes looking at technology, staffing, culture, and policy. And I'll talk a little bit about our experiences in all of those. I'll say a little bit about myself for a second. Apparently on my Twitter feed, I flag myself as a repository pragmatist. I am probably more an evolutionary than a revolutionary. I am a passionate believer in open access and open repositories. And I think one of the challenges is as we look at how long we have been doing some of this, sometimes we think, are we really actually making progress? But actually we are. I think we are sometimes a challenge around managing our expectations. But I think we can look back at recent times and see there has been quite a lot of change. We are nowhere near done. There is so much to do, so much to actually take forward. But as I say, I'm delighted to be part of this community and to be able to work with people like yourselves who are also clearly passionate about the transformative power of open repositories and the way in which we can share scholarly communication and take things forward. Just a little bit of clarification as to where I'm from. So from the city of Glasgow in the the city of Glasgow, which is in the west coast of Scotland. So Claire Knowles, who is in Edinburgh, that's the other side of the country. So it's great to come here to Montana to catch up with Claire. There is, however, a Glasgow, Montana, which is apparently the seat of Valley County in Montana. Who knew? Population 3,250. And apparently, according to Wikipedia, they picked Glasgow as the name because they spun a globe. So I'm not from there. I'm from Scotland. So I can actually. That would be very annoying for anybody else out and about. So beyond that, it's 2018. So I guess part of my sustainability narrative is about the importance for us of embedding our repository in an institution. So our institution was founded in 1451. So we are celebrating our 517th anniversary this year. So we think we know a little bit about sustainability and being able to actually take things forward. So if we look here as a little bit of a timeline, 1776. I guess there may have been some other things going on here during then, but Adam Smith, as part of the Enlightenment, published The Wealth of Nations. And one of the reasons that we call our repository service Enlighten is to reflect that Enlightenment nature. It is about opening up knowledge, sharing, and so on. So we're really, really excited about all of that. So, as a sort of spoiler alert, I'm going to jump to the end of my presentation and say that actually I think we have a successful, sustainable, embedded repository here at the University of Glasgow. All these many arrows are pointing in multiple directions of the variety of ways in which we try to add value. I was smiling when Christian was talking about kind of staff profiles. Those are exactly, what we have to do for some of ours at the university, but looking at the ways in which we are part of a richer research infrastructure within the university, within the higher education sector, within the United Kingdom. So, as I say there, we use the word service an awful lot. We don't use the word repository a lot. We don't find repository a very helpful word when we're having discussions with academic colleagues and faculty. We do find that when we rebranded our university as Enlighten, with a nod to some extent to Caltech, I really liked at the time, Caltech badged theirs as CODA, and it became this sort of umbrella term. And having this umbrella term was really vital because it helped to cover a variety of the tools and a variety of the services. So it wasn't just about the single institutional repository. And we have, as you can see here, these are kind of my big three, or our university's big three. There's an overarching search service. We have publications. We have one for our postgraduate theses. We have one for research data. And we've built these all separately, all using the same underlying ePrint software, but they're all separate because they all have very different metadata needs. They have very different audiences, and they give us opportunities to engage with academics in a slightly different way. So it feels like we've been doing this for a very long time, and I was going back and having a look at all of that. And again, kind of reflecting Christian's comments previously, those excellent questions, you know, to ask when you get your funding and how effectively can you transition from that funding which you have into ensuring that your project is sustainable and it doesn't just end up as a dead end. And I think one of the things that we were very keen from 2002 to 2005 when we started our repository work was we built sustainability into the DNA of that project. We seconded staff within the university to do that. We upskilled internally around that, and we used part of that project to make the business case to look at how we are actually going to sustain it beyond the 2002 and 2005. So that was really a key element. We rebranded it. It's always good to have a rebrand, and actually called it Enlighten in 2006. And as I say, that has worked very well as a shorthand term. The funding landscape has continued to change sort of quite radically, but there has been institutional commitment and institutional support to that. And as part of that journey, we set up a publications policy as well, which actively encouraged people to start depositing and putting content into our repository. I think we really did start out as sort of self-depositing activists. We don't really do self-deposit now. We are very big on mediation. And we do that. We also repositioned it, so it also became a publications database. So it became a sort of slightly hybrid repository. And I think that was a really important decision to make, because I think there was a danger of ghettoizing the open access repository, which was sitting there languishing with hardly any content while we put all the metadata and all the other content in. So we almost wanted to pump prime the repository with the metadata. So moving beyond that, the really big change was in 2010. In 2010, we started doing really exciting, well, we thought in 2010 it was exciting, which was linking publications specifically to authors, starting to use author identifiers, not ORCID yet, that came later, but also to funders as well. So it was all about value add, okay? So we kept continuing to value add. In 2016, we built our research data repository. We started extending out. And so this year, it's 2018, we have launched another repository focusing on open education resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about a national assessment exercise, and there's a lot of work that we're doing that supports that, and that will be in, or the results of that will be in 2021. But I think the exciting thing during that journey is everything has changed around us, politically, technically, culturally. So I would like to shout out to bodies like CORE, bodies like Spark, initiatives like OpenCon, funding from the European Union, changes within the funders in the UK that have helped to make open the default so that becomes our new kind of lingua franca. So again, looking at that, this is almost sort of a slightly Stephen Covey-esque fire within diagram of sort of staffing, culture, policy, and technology, which together actually help to contribute and build towards our sustainability. So initially with that, we look at staffing. This is actually not just for the repository, this is for our overall open access support and various things. So we have a number of staff who manage the metadata and the support for the repository itself. We have technical support locally, as well as outsourced with ePrint services. We have a research information manager, and we've sort of positioned the repository as I say, this key piece of research infrastructure that drives and delivers lots of elements beyond open access. So it's reporting on compliance, it's reporting on all kinds of other elements. So we have a wide range of staff, and I think that's been a critical element of our sustainability as well. You know, it isn't a siloed team or one or two people. We have really needed to look at how we stitch this across the business of the library and the university. And that sort of began back in 2008, and it was very exciting when this went through at our university senate. It was accepted. It was fantastic to hear Enlighten talked about at the university senate. It suddenly made it really real, and it went through, and it was a really good place for us to start and to take that forward. But we also have national drivers, and I appreciate that for other places there may not be quite those same drivers yet, but national or statewide drivers, funder drivers, are incredibly powerful in supporting sustainable and making that difference. So we have a national assessment exercise, we have an open access policy that came in on the 1st of April, and in order for your outputs to be eligible in this exercise, they need to demonstrate their open access compliance. So we're using the repository to hold the copies of the open access material. We're using it to manage that exercise. But apart from that, as well as it says here, it's also good research practice for us to promote that. We've worked really closely. We work in partnership with our research office, with our faculty, and with our colleges in order to actually deliver all of this and stitch all of that sustainability into the rules. Some other work that has been done, a number of UK institutions are exploring this. We now have a sort of website up and running as well. This is the UK Scholarly Communications license. So this is also, I guess, another front in that Scholcom kind of skirmishing and engagement, where we are looking at, researchers retaining and reusing the rights in their own work. It's essentially sort of the Harvard model. There's a lot of support from a number of institutions, from Research Libraries UK. I guess it would be fair to say there has been some pushback from publishers around all of this, so we've probably not moved as fast on this as we would like. But again, it has been a catalyst for discussion, and institutions are the ones, again, working with our faculty and our libraries, are in those kind of front lines looking at how we can take all of that forward. So we'll just say a little bit about how we support the kind of open access, the funders and this research excellence framework, our national assessment. So there's been a really big sea change. In the old days, we would sort of wait for academics at some point to give us their papers, or we would try and get them to self-deposit. With the result of the changes for this assessment exercise, we have them tell us when the paper is actually accepted, okay? So they need to just fire an email to our Library Enlighten team to say, hey, my paper has been accepted, and we will work with them to support what do we need to do to put it into the repository? What do we need to do? Is there funding we have available to pay some of them, any APCs, for instance, or anything else that we can do to support that? And on the right-hand side, this is a browse view of Enlighten. What's really interesting is, I guess we're now in June, and it looks like we have about 3,000, sort of just over 3,000 outputs or records for outputs in the repository in the middle of the year. And in past performance, it looks like we get about over 6,500. So we are tracking much more closely to the publications and the outputs of the institution. Our most recent figures are showing that we have about an 83% kind of compliance rate as we are working with our academic colleagues around that. And I think that has just been fantastic. We've been able to sort of leverage that and work with it. And the library has taken on board much of that, which is why we've moved away from self-deposit to provide that value add. And it becomes a new service that we actually just provide to the academy, to the faculty at Glasgow. So technology and metadata, we've been an ePrint shop for a very long time. We do some things with Archivum for our research data. We're starting to do much more with ORCID. But I think here the message for our integration, for our sustainability is integration, and it's integration, 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 okay? The really big sea change is when your repository becomes a nexus and it actually plugs into all of these other systems in the university, whether it's the HR system for performance review, so that we can push out outputs to that, whether it is for the staff profiles, ways in which we can populate the university web, ways in which we can alleviate reporting burdens to funders by being able to pull that data out of the repository, using tools like the publication router feed, which gives us a feed of outputs who are from publishers of outputs which have been published by Glasgow staff, moving to virtual machines to increase our resilience and our robustness, and this slightly interesting one at the bottom, Google Love. So Google really quite likes our repository. I saw a great comment recently which said, nobody really cares as much about how what your repository looks like. And in some respects, our repository is almost invisible. Many people interact with our repository not through the front door. You know, it is surfaced in all of these other places. And as long as we can surface it in all these other places, then that's fantastic. And here's an example of that. So our vice principal for research, we've just started a couple of weeks ago. We're very excited. We're surfacing the ORCIDs into all our staff profiles. So the library in the university is managing ORCIDs. ORCIDs are going into our institutional repository and then being pushed out into other systems. So we're using them to backfill publications which we have in the repository and push them out. Publication outputs and research data can all be pushed automatically out. And again, one of the other things that's really powerful is when we had moved to a point where nobody can manually add any publications into these staff profiles. So if it's not in the repository, then it's not there. So usually we can tell during performance and review or promotion that we get many requests from staff where they may have identified some gaps and various things, and we can work with them to do that. In terms of culture, yeah, we moved very much no longer to a why do I need to do this, but what is the best way for me to give you what I've got, and we try to make that as low barrier and easy as possible. And as I say, moving from beyond that into open education resources, being able to capture all kinds of other material. We've started doing some more with our postgraduate researchers. We now flag their outputs in our institutional repository so that we start to give them parity with our faculty members around that, and that's been a really exciting project over the last year. So looping back to where we were, this is just one of our repositories, and it sits here at the heart of a number of the things that we do, feeding into or pushing out to all of these various different things. And essentially, part of our sustainability plan, I guess, is almost to be utterly indispensable. So, we are making ourselves absolutely critical to the function, the business, and the delivery of the university. And I think as we look ahead, so as I say at the outset, I'm an evolutionary, not a revolutionary. It would be lovely to have baked in digital preservation and all these really other great things when we started our repository. We haven't, but we are now coming to a point where, yeah, we really need to be doing all of that. We have a new digital preservation policy. We need to keep an eye on all the exciting work. Already we're hearing at conference about next generation repositories, all the work that's going on there. So I think for us, we have a distinct commitment to open. okay? I think we have a very clear vision and scope around what we are doing with our core repository, what we are doing with our services, being guided and where we can make that transformative difference with our colleagues. Building that high-level institutional support has been absolutely vital, and ensuring that we actually make that investment, okay? So we have that investment, that we've made that decision, that we are going to prioritize support for the repository, support for open access and research information management, and adding value, okay? Adding value, adding value, adding value, making ourselves indispensable, and not being an island. So coming back to that integration. So not only being able to come here to Montana to share our stories with yourselves, but equally within the university, tying things together, being part of that rich community and that element. So thank you very much. That was a sort of canter through our story, but thank you for your time and attention.
Questions?
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anna Sackman. I'm at the University of California, Berkeley. My question is about the outreach and the messaging that you did to get that 83% compliance rate. And then who are the holdouts? What about the other 17%? What are their kind of research behaviors, and do you have a plan to get them in as well?
We do. So I think, as I say, part of this is around driving that compliance. Some of that is really just around raising awareness. Our College of Arts is the one college that is not a holdout. It actually does self-deposit. One of the things that a little project I've also been doing is, as we come into our next performance review cycle, for our research staff, they're actually going to get an indicator in a red, amber, and green as to the status of their output for compliance with the ref. And this is intended really just to start a discussion and to raise that visibility, and essentially to say, you know, come and talk to us in the library. And we've tried to make it as frictionless and as low barrier as possible, which, as I say, really fire us an email, and we have an mail account. We have it manned, personed every day, and we provide that support. So we do have ongoing advocacy. We're very happy to go and talk to schools and to go and talk to colleges. So yeah, it's ongoing.
Other questions?
I was just curious what kind of people resources you have. It looks like you're mediating 6,500 deposits a year. Are you determining depositor rights and other aspects of a deposit when you're doing that? I'm just curious how many folks you have working on this.
So we have at any one time 3 or 4 people in our metadata services team, so our cataloging team, and they provide a lot of support around that. A lot of it is also around the kind of life cycle of the output. So we start with very bare metadata to start with, where it is merely just accepted, and it's been really interesting getting in much earlier in that process. But yeah, we do have a team who does spend a chunk of time doing that. I guess for me as well, there's almost this interesting analogy. I am not against self-deposit, and we have some self-deposit, but I guess there's also an element, if you'll bear with me as an analogy, we don't ask our faculty to catalog their own books in our library management system. So what we can do, though, is we can look at how we can provide that support and that investment for the repository side of things for their outputs.
Other questions? All right, let's thank William again. And our next 2 presenters are Jim Del Rosso and Aaron Folder from Cornell University.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out. Today, what we're going to try to cover in the next half hour or so is talk a little bit about our experience with creating a repository principles and practices handbook at the Cornell University Library. We're going to talk a little bit about where the handbook came from, who wrote it, what it contains, and how we plan to use it, and how we hope that you'll engage with it as well. My name is Jim Del Rosso. I'm the Digital Projects Coordinator at the Hospitality, Labor, and Management Library at Cornell University.
I'm Erin Falder. I'm the Digital Archivist at the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections, also at Cornell University Library.
So we figure it was probably best to start off by giving you a sense of Cornell's repository ecosystem. And you'll notice they're really small, but we have links at the bottom of each slide. That's actually to where the handbook lives in our wiki at Cornell, which is open to anybody and where you can comment, and also to eCommons, where there's a PDF version of the handbook as well. So Cornell's repository ecosystem could probably best be described as sprawling and historically decentralized. Those two things are related. Many of Cornell's unit libraries used to have budgets that were tied to their schools, be very autonomous, and that's changed recently, but a lot of these sprang up independently from the central library, and individual projects would crop up along the way, and they weren't always integrated into the larger existing systems. So as budgets started to get more centralized, we started to look to streamlining. In 2014, we formed the Repository Executive Group, which reflected both the need for increased and improved communication between units and the need to be more efficient and streamlined within the new budget model at Cornell. But we needed, in order to facilitate communication, start talking about this stuff, we needed to kind of get an inventory of what was out there. You know, we can't communicate, we can't set policy if no one shares the same conception of that landscape, which, as I said, was sprawling and increasingly decentralized. So one of the first of many working subgroups that RepoExec convened was an inventory subgroup. Keep track of how many repositories are actually out there, how many systems we have that hold Cornell University Library assets and are part of the library. So we convened that in 2014. How many repositories do you think we found? Shout out some guesses. All right, so we heard a wide range. So in 2014, we found 22 repositories managed by the Cornell University Library. Now again, this is just within CUL, not within Cornell as a whole. There are probably some others out there that no one bothered to tell us about. And our working definition again was systems that contain CUL's digital assets. So yeah, in 2014, we found 22. Part of the inventory's charge was every couple years, though, we're going to check this and see how many are out there now. So in 2016, we found 26 of them. So yeah, we needed to work on pulling some of this in and starting to work on streamlining, setting policies, and so forth. So RepoExec was facilitating communication. That part was working. The inventory was providing us with a basic framework for starting to talk about policy around these. The next step that seemed to make sense for us was to establish some principles that would underlie that policy as well. So in 2016, the Repository Principles Working Group, which Erin and I co-chaired, was convened. And then in 2018, we completed our work on the handbook that we're talking about today. So why did it take 2 years? Let's start by talking a little bit about the specific charge that we received. I swear we're going to start talking a little bit about the specific charge that we received. Getting a nice spinning icon. So our charge, which I'll read while I'm waiting for it to be here, is to develop a set of principles to facilitate decision-making and priority setting for Cornell's repository environment and advocate for the adoption of those principles by Cornell. Now, spoiler warning, the principles actually didn't take long. We got great buy-in from both the subgroup and RepoExec as a whole, but there was also this immediate sense that we had to go further, and I'm not just talking about within this slide deck. So we said we need to actually provide guidance. Hey, okay, let me go back a little. We need to provide guidance on how to make these principles actionable. And our primary audience here was repository managers, both new and old, because repo exec could not actually dictate policy. That was still being determined at the unit level. We can make recommendations, but if we wanted to influence how things were being done, we needed to connect with folks on the ground. So we enlisted local experts because, again, we needed the people who had been doing this, who could redirect, point us to standards, point us to what they had learned and what they were enacting in their own best practices. We needed to focus on function. We didn't want to be pointing people to tools that were out of date or irrelevant when they could go to a department within Cornell, people who knew the score, and actually start working with them. Okay, it froze up again. I'm just going to keep going. And then we just ended up doing a hell of a lot of writing. So I want to hopefully go to the slide where it'll show who did the writing. Maybe. Excellent. So these are the folks who actually ended up writing this. And our process was that we would get a couple of people to volunteer, experts to write a given section. They would bring their draft back to the subgroup, who would suggest revisions. They would come up with a revised version. When the subgroup signed off on it, it would go to the whole of repo exec, who would again suggest more revisions, and that iterative process event would produce the final version of each section that would then go into the wiki and be shared openly within CUL. And as you can see, we drew from a variety of sources, and some people here have held multiple jobs. We had UX, UI folks working on it. And it really helped us produce something that spoke to what was happening on the ground with repositories. Now, in terms of the results, the principles that we came up with were that repositories are services that require support. They are not discrete projects or information silos. They exist within the Cornell's repository ecosystem. Repository services are dedicated to preserving and providing access to digital objects and their metadata. Repository services should be developed with users' needs, ethos, and workflows in mind. And repository services are dedicated to sustainable support and access of the objects for users. And we saw these principles as things that would support decision-making and prioritization, reducing chaos. And they underlie the rest of the document. And the rest of that document is what Aaron is going to talk about now. I'll leave that up for a second so you can see them, and then the actual clicking on the arrows.
Okay. So the handbook essentially ended up being 60 pages long, and it was designed from the beginning to be modular. We knew that our audience, again, our repository managers, both existing and new, would be coming at this resource from a variety of places, different needs, because again, we have 26 of these things. So we needed people to have a variety of entrance points. There are, again, challenges, but also some great benefits to this modularity. Some of the challenges is that there is a lot of duplication of content, and that duplication is really based in the context of each section, but we can link all of those things together using the wiki model. Many of the topics are really designed to be pointers for what folks need to think about, rather than comprehensive knowledge about any of these topics. If we wanted to go comprehensive, it would have taken us a lot longer. But most of the topics have some sort of introduction about the issues that repository managers should think about. That being said, there are a couple of starting points for the handbook. The first is, the introduction, what it should be. It provides some basic context of how the project got started, what's in the handbook, but most importantly, it really lays out the various roles that people could play within a repository infrastructure. Some of the role titles you may find idiosyncratic, but we tried to make it relevant, again, to what we knew was happening on the ground. We also know that even at Cornell, many people may fill a single role, and again, a single person may fill multiple roles. So these roles, again, became sort of the key touchstone for much of the language around who does what within the handbook. Although it's modular, we do have two sections, or these first three sections really, that we recommend people start with. The first is define your repository scope. This is where you define the service, your collection, and your audience. The idea is that by starting here, you can facilitate success by ensuring that the content meets the needs of the users and that the infrastructure both supports your users and your content. We talk about intellectual content, content formats, active versus passive collecting, user communities, and checking to see if there's already a repository that may fit your needs. Again, we have over 20. And it touches a little bit on interoperability. The other section that we recommend people start with is service planning. And this is where you go through and sort of do a needs assessment. What staffing and resources are required? Who's in what role? Do you have some sort of succession planning in place? What kind of policy writing is there? Do you have any issues with contract renewal or negotiation depending on your infrastructure? And most importantly, what is your exit plan? So if these are sort of the key places to begin with, there are additional sections in the handbook, and they're mostly in alphabetical order because, again, this is designed to be modular to help folks start at a topic that they either know something about already or it's a topic that they think they need to work on for their particular needs. So one of the sections is access, which is really around discovery and delivery. This covers issues around providing end users with the material that serves their particular needs. We talk about discovery functions within the repository and without the repository infrastructure. We talk about delivery of content based on formats and access issues, mediation of access based on content needs of the depositors and the users. We talk about the user experience of the environment, accessibility of both the interface and of the content, and usability studies to direct ongoing support and improvement. There is a section around assessment of impact, and we had to first clarify in this process what we meant by assessment. Often in this handbook, it's used as sort of the colloquial assessment in libraries, but there are plenty of other areas throughout the handbook where assessment of your service is really valuable. However, in this section, we really are talking about usage statistics, impact stories, user satisfaction, and usability of your service. There's a section in the handbook around curation. This is where we talk about what content within the repository is and how you select and manage that over time, again, to support your identified communities. This section covers how do you determine intellectual stewardship of that content, digitization needs, working with analog material and digital surrogates. It touches a little bit on metadata, but stay tuned, and identifying content creators and rights holders who are not always the same. There is a section on policy and documentation, which is my favorite topic. Again, since the handbook is designed to be modular, we wanted to make sure that the decisions that you would be making throughout the handbook could be easily pulled together, and so we did that sort of through this policy and documentation section. It tries to give a high-level overview of what kinds of policies and procedures documentation should cover, and where to go in the handbook for more information about how to develop this kind of information. It also covers the work involved in care and feeding of your documentation, because it always requires management, and what roles, again, roles within the repository may be affected by the policies or procedures developed for the service, and there's sort of a spreadsheet that maps that out. There's a section on infrastructure and interoperability. Infrastructure is really defined as the servers, the software, and the practices. That's the foundation of the repository service. And although it's written by our IT specialists, the audience, again, was our repository managers who may be unfamiliar with technical jargon and issues. We explored how to think about infrastructure maintenance need and potential issues, how implementation decisions may affect the long-term infrastructure management and maintenance, how to review technical constraints that may affect the perceived service, and a short list of service integrations, so discovery, extract, transform, and load processes, authentication. This is, again, a short list that may be of interest to potential repository managers. As promised, there is, of course, a section on metadata design and best practices. It's really about how to think about metadata design in conjunction with the needs of the collections, the users, and the infrastructure. We talk about what a metadata production could look like and the needs of metadata maintenance over time. We didn't dive into any specific metadata standards because, again, we have such a varied ecosystem and a varied set of needs. But like many of our sections, we refer to our in-house specialists if and when some sort of repository manager needs specific implementation recommendations. There is a section on outreach. And this is how do you engage with a particular community for greater impact on your specific goal. The section outlines how to identify your audiences, set goals, identify potential outreach partnerships, and how to craft a value statement to set up your pitch. There's a section on preservation, and this is really where we highlight the need for preservation strategists to participate in curation activities. The core preservation activities that we identified were how do you mitigate or ways to mitigate external threats, how to ensure content integrity and authenticity, identify and capture essential documentation to support long-term preservation, and how do you start thinking and preparing for obsolescence. And finally, rights management. This section really covers two key questions: who can deposit, and how do you assess for copyright concerns? There's also a section on takedown requests. So this was a really large undertaking, as you might imagine, but we have already seen some really great use of the material. So as we mentioned, the repo exec is really there as a central point of communication. We can promote this as a resource to our repository managers, but we can't mandate it. We can't use it to mandate policies or set procedures. So it's really on the units to do that work, and we want to facilitate that by making it very transparent what it really takes to run a repository, and we hope that this handbook does that. As we mentioned, our Cornell audiences really are the existing repository managers, but we also imagine that library liaisons would be key stakeholders in knowing that this resource exists, because they are often the ones talking to folks who think that setting up another digital repository is a great idea. We also imagine that this could be useful to administrators who need help understanding the scope of work that's involved in running a repository service. Already, we have had one staff member come to us and share that this document has helped them shift the conversation that they were having with professionals in their area about starting up a new data repository. And instead, they're now looking at existing repositories that could be enhanced to fit their particular needs. This is great. This means that hopefully we've staved off a 27th repository. And finally, we do intend to market this resource to these sets of audiences. We'll send out emails later this summer to relevant lists of folks who might be interested in knowing this resource exists. We have a presentation scheduled for later this month at our research and outreach meeting, where many of these members of our target audience are already likely to attend. And finally, this is designed from the beginning to be a living document. These practices change over time. Our ecosystem will change over time. So we have set a revisions schedule as part of the repo exec community to revise on a yearly schedule. So this is how we imagine Cornell will use it, but we expect and we hope that the community will engage with it as well. So we're hoping that you who are in the audience here can help us provide some feedback. Here is the link, hopefully slightly larger, to the wiki environment where you can comment in the wiki about what you think is missing. Is there something that's unclear? Is there information that you would have expected to find, but you didn't? We also know that sometimes you just really want to take it and make it your own. So we have published it in our institutional repository eCommons at this link, the handle, as a single PDF. Please feel free to remix, reuse, take it, make it better for your own purposes. It's available in the CC BY and C. So with that, we're willing to take questions now.
Do we have questions? Okay.
I look forward to reading this. I was quickly looking for it online, and I came up with in the Confluence a different URL than you've listed, and I wonder if maybe because you were logged into your site, you may have a different URL. But the one that I'm seeing is Confluence Cornell edu/display/CLU public/Cornell, and then the title of it, so it's much longer.
So the URL that we've listed here is more of a permanent thing, so if we change the title of it, the URL that you're seeing will no longer be valid. So this is one that will be permanently attached to that wiki page.
Okay, I guess one of the troubles I'm having with that one is I think that's a 0 between the Z and the F. I've tried it both ways and it doesn't work. So is that something you're expecting to work in the future?
It should have.
It was working when we tested it and when we put it in here.
You got it? All right, maybe I typed something wrong. I'll try again. Thanks.
Are there other questions?
Thank you for speaking and for sharing this resource. I'm kind of curious, this might be a little bit off topic, but when y'all started meeting as part of the Repo Exec Committee, was there any discussion about trying to merge any of your 26 repositories?
Yes. That's been an item of discussion for quite some time, and there have been some that have been merged and just the older version not necessarily sunsetted. You know, we were doing a lot of work at the start of Repo Exec around some of our image repositories where we had multiple ones up and running at the time, and we've worked to streamline that. Some of the others, there's questions about the software solution, what's going to be the long-term vision and solution, or at least the medium term. You know, so we have at the moment 4 IR-style repositories within Cornell, and talking about how to merge those, streamline them, while preserving some of the branding and so forth that led to them being separate in the first place, is a long-standing item of discussion. So yeah, I think for most of this content, merging several into one would be the best solution, so that we still are maintaining access and to that content, as opposed to just sunsetting the system and the content with it. But yeah, that's been a long-standing discussion, and we've had some successes on that front.
Are there other questions?
I think today we're hearing a lot about how communities are really drivers of these things, and if you have the right community, they will sustain it with volunteers if necessary. What struck me about our entire open access movement is how short-lived it has been. I came here by car. I went through the Crazy Horse Memorial on the way. This is a project that foresees 150 years before they will finish the carving on the mountainside. It took them 50 years to finish the face of Crazy Horse. They have a foundation that runs a visitor center to raise money and keep things going, and they refused when the government said they would come in and help out. They didn't want the government coming in and then bailing out later. They wanted to keep this a private effort. So they had a contract since 1930 or something like that, I think, with the Sioux Indian Nation to start work on this, and they came up with a community that committed itself to this whole process. I don't think we can say that's just a family affair if it really is still going after this long and still has a vision for completing. So when I look at 26 repositories at Cornell that may have propped up in the last 15 years, and I think about my own repositories' financial ups and downs, and I think I'm not sure that any of us have really come up with a community business model that matches what they're doing with the Crazy Horse Memorial. And we need to start rethinking how we're doing this, because if we're only thinking this from the point of view of our own work for the next couple years, we're not really talking about sustainability.
Did you have a question?
That was a comment, I think. So, are there any other questions or comments?
One thing I'm interested about is whether you think there's an ideal number of repositories that you aspire to. Not everybody aspires to one repository, but I think most people don't aspire to 26. So is there somewhere in the middle that you think is the best way, or where you sort of hope to get to?
I don't think so. I think it's going to be a constant negotiation. I mean, I would like to see less than 10 as just a personal goal in life. But I think it's always sort of these different communities have different needs, and we have to constantly be balancing that.
Any other questions? Okay.
Just wondering, as you continue to market and share this, have you considered sharing the guide in open educational resources, circles and spaces, and talking to library schools and that sort of thing? Hearing you talk about it, I saw a lot of parallels between some other recent scholarly communications, educational materials efforts, and I think this could be very valuable to people who aren't practitioners yet but might want to be.
I think library schools were definitely on our short list. We do have some plans to market this more broadly to a broader community, but we haven't figured all of that out yet. So it's nice to know that you do see some synergy there.
Any other questions?
Hi, so I'm curious, with the different repository managers that this is for, have they responded in a way that they've further documented their own individual workflows in terms of operations and problems they've dealt with, and has it facilitated further communication among the different repository managers?
As a manager of 2 repositories, I can say that the work that's gone into developing this has absolutely caused me to revisit a lot of my workflows, what I've done, and so forth. And I have gotten feedback from some newer repository managers or people who are taking it on that they found this helpful. And we've also kind of invited some of them to be a part of this as well. At the level of RepoExec as a whole, which, as I said, as we said, is primarily fulfilling a function of communication among the various stakeholders around this. At the very least, the discussions of these individual sections within that broader RepoExec group have raised questions about workflow and so forth, and what we should be putting forward and what we should be aspiring to within the repositories that we manage at Cornell.
Anything else? Okay, thank you.
So I absolutely am in awe of this. I want to know what's next for RepoExec, and if you are now talking with the other repository managers about maybe collecting workflows or examining workflows together, because to me that seems like that would be a good natural next step. And I'm also thinking about my situation with 23 campuses. So if that is a next step, I'm very interested to hear about it.
I don't think we really have a next step. I think the next thing that we might do is another survey of our repositories just to see how they've grown or shrunk. I think also there's some interest in using this to maybe try and set some priorities for which repositories migrate to what next. But I like the idea of synthesizing workflows. I think that would help us identify repository infrastructures that are compatible with the content across some of these 26 that we have. But yeah, at this point, we should say that this only got finished, what, a month and a half ago?
Something like that.
So we're still sort of riding the wave of, oh goodness, we're done.
And the only thing I would add to that is, for a little more context, this is the inventory subgroup and the principal subgroup are not the only 2 subgroups that RepoExec has convened. It's convened multiple subgroups in the 4 going on 5 years that it's existed. Those were the 2 that, obviously, this was the one that we were talking about the efforts of, and the inventory most directly led to it. So I do believe that RepoExec will probably be continuing to convene subgroups to look at given issues, though, as Aaron said, one of the ones that's coming up is we are due to redo the inventory and see if the number's gone up or down. But there are others on the agenda, and RepoExec is always on the lookout for figuring out how to best fulfill its charge within the varied ecosystem at Cornell. And in terms of getting repository managers in the room, that's actually a function that RepoExec serves. Generally speaking, if you're managing a repository at Cornell, you're getting an invitation to the RepoExec meetings. It's actually a very large group, something in the range of 12 to 15 people in the room, depending on who can make the meeting that month. But that's also one of the reasons why the group has tended to do its on-the-ground action through smaller subgroups. Does that answer?
Any other questions? Well, if not, let's thank Aaron and Jim, and also thank all of our speakers. And we'll release everyone a little bit early. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I got 90, 91.
Okay, so they're good to go. And then yay. This is good. Okay, there's one here.
I see that.
Yeah, okay. Why does the chair thing back up? Well, definitely kind of like people can see the size. Yeah, it's always a problem, but maybe that's fine because yeah. Do each of the rooms have these in them? They do. That's awesome. They are very helpful, actually. Or we could just. To unwind it? Yeah. Okay. Feeling good. Wanna
Does this thing, the
you
split
want-
bullet doesn't work? Oh, you have a fancy one without the physical escape button. How do you even get out the slide deck?
Escape.
Oh, it does still work.
Do you need notes? Presenter view?
Does the presenter view work in this setup?
Well, that's why I never use Google Docs because
because it sometimes does, sometimes
exactly.
doesn't.
So we downloaded.
Let's see. Let's see what happens. See, no, it doesn't.
And you could mess with the screens, but then it might screw us up.
I don't want to screw you up. That would just be uncharitable.
So if you'd prefer, we could swap out machines.
Well,
that's the option.
I would be in exactly the similar situation. Oops, it is. I'd be in exactly the same situation on my box because the monitor split either works or does not. It looks like it's.
So you were counting on slide notes?
I was not counting on slide notes.
Do any of your presenters?
Oh shit! Some of them do have. So this is me, but I mean I have notes, but I don't count them. But Don's stuff he has.
So do you want to download a PowerPoint? It's fine.
No, because PowerPoint will break transitions. I have before success with Google Slides translating seamlessly to PowerPoint, and I don't want to find out why, but it doesn't work.
Okay, then so the option is ask people if they really need their notes, or I guess, or you could use, let's just try this machine with your notes. Can you dig up your link? Because maybe we can configure this so it works.
Yeah, maybe. Can I I dig up the link? No, but I can look at this, which has the link.
Great. Yay.
Although, oh, there's no way you can type that shit.
Here, why don't you, hang on, I can log in too, not connected. Yeah, I don't want to type that in. But can you get
If I logged into my Google Drive,
exactly.
then I might be able to find it.
Where,
Wow. You don't like to live dangerously?
no, not right now.
No, don't know yet. Yeah. We're seeing if we can get presenter view working. Did the other laptop not? Well,
No, we don't. We can grab seats.
Hannah, we don't want to try to mess up.
Well, now I'm.
Oops, I don't want to do that because this is not on my box. I'll do this.
So we're presenting from PowerPoint and local video. So we're just, yeah, I did. I checked. We were gonna just use my machine, but we're having the classic Google presenter that doesn't show notes for people who might.
Do you want to just download it? And
I'm worried about transitions, not transitioning. Wait.
Mine transferred, downloaded mine.
What's the issue? We're seeing if we can get presenter view working with. Presenter view. Yeah. This is just
Yes.
So that's that. So this Internet Explorer is not.
so what about Firefox?
Yeah, I was just gonna say this is gonna be because if I go to the notes thing, it's gonna bring up notes there, which we don't want. Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. All right, let's try Firefox.
Just copy and paste.
Keep feeling I'm on Windows. It's Control Copy, not Apple Copy.
I love it. That's my favorite.
Yeah, I think that's also the best. All right, so get presenter view. I'm guessing that now we're going to have to muck around with mirroring, yeah, which is at least I can get presenter view this way. None of these are screen stuff.
Yes, friend.
Control panel. We are just trying to get split screen working, so we have presenter view on here and display up there. Yeah, which is what we're trying to avoid because, just in case the PowerPoint doesn't work. I think if we extend the desktop, that should work because then we can put the Google slide on one screen.
For the first anyways.
Yeah. See, we can do this. So I can't see what I'm doing on the big screen, but
That's not mine.
wait, what are we doing?
No. We just did the.
Is that on the full screen widget? I can't see. That's not on full screen? That's not the full screen widget? Oh, that's the one I was going for. All right, there. So now, drag my mouse back over.
Right.
Speaker notes.
No, they go first. So if you
All right, so there. Right, there you go. So I think that is, I said, no, it's not working. I was expecting it to click through that way. Okay, that's clicking through there. All right, we got to click through then. We can't use the cursor keys. So you have to actually click through on the next deck. You can't see if space. Does space work? Space works too, so okay.
Space.
All right. Yeah, I'm used to using the cursor keys to go forward and back for that. So.
They do. They just.
Oh, yeah, you had a full screen in there too. Okay, so there you go.
So you're good. You got your notes on your image, just the way you want them. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. And the notes are in the wrong place. Google Doc thing, Layla took the right out.
So we were originally scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Right. But they had double booked Mark Jordan at that same slot. And our presenters, each of the panelists, 12 minutes. So it's just me. I go 5 minutes. So I say so. I say as much. But yeah, but it's working. I'm doing it on my first slide. I'm saying I'm introducing the officer. Each one's 1 minute. So yeah, there's me for 5 minutes. 3 presenters for 12 each.
So, fantastic.
So space or keys both work to advance.
Cool. Great. Okay.
Okay.
Good. I was copying.
Yeah.
I saw your notes.
I have so much confidence. I saw the test.
Oh,
Seasoned professional. You're great. I wrote a speaker notes. So did I. Yeah. It's a great idea. Okay.
I've actually seen you guys have that story.
Where's the camera?
I'm gonna try.
Where's the camera? Stars and stuff. You wanna just test the slides?
Because it's left and right. Yeah.
Yeah. Just making sure, you know.
Cool.
Great. I thought subverts all of our everything that's going to come next. It's like, say, look, guys, we're making another specification. I know. But yes.
That's a nice thing about it.
Yeah, there's embedded in there. I have not seen it yet.
Very end. Yeah, I mean, I go through it. But I don't think that. Yeah, I was very. Preserve her. Cross it over and I can't remember the name of the guy that got it. Am I really? Are we going in order? Because in which case, someone else. Where would we be without?
Hi. Everybody keeps saying that. I'm timing you specifically, yeah. Get started in 1 minute. Would you please sit down? Thank you.
Oh, finally, y'all are Would you, Mike, would you rather zoom into this? No.
Yes, he does.
There is a light.
All right, we're going to get started if Mike's done. My name is Declan Fleming. I'm from the University of California, San Diego, and thank you all for coming to this session. We have two great panels, basically, one about the Oxford Common File Layout, another one about collections as data. And I'm going to introduce the first one. We'll go halfway through, and then I will moderate some of the timing and the questions, and then we'll go on to the next group. So Julian Morley from Stanford University will provide an overview of MOAB, which served as inspiration for OCFL, as well as what Stanford is hoping to gain from OCFL. Don Brower Bauer from Notre Dame will talk about the lessons learned from Notre Dame system. Rosalind Metz from Memory will talk about the preservation needs for their forthcoming Samvera repository. Andrew Hankinson will then provide an overview of OCFL. We'll then close the panel discussion where the audience will have a chance to ask questions. I was also told to remind you about the Ideas Challenge. I sneaked that one in. It's very important. It's going on out here still. If you're looking for a partner, the desk is in the middle. You can talk to someone out there. I don't have a star because I'm a judge and I will be judging you. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jillian.
You're judging me already, aren't you? All right. So, right, well, you thought this was an OCFL panel, right? Well, no, it's not. I'm going to talk about Moab. Before we get started, could I have a show of hands? Who here has heard of Moab in the context of preservation? Okay, so some of you. All right, so hopefully... How about now? Would it actually... there we go. All right, is that better? Oh, I can hear myself now, so that must be better. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to give a brief overview of Moab. I'm going to race through the first couple of slides. I promise I will slow down when I get to the meat. Okay, so Moab was created by Richard Anderson when he worked at Stanford Libraries back in 2012. It was part of the digital library build-out that Stanford did to replace the original version of SDR and our use of Baggett files as our preservation layer. There is a paper. There's the title to the code flip paper that we wrote in July of 2013. And if any of you have forgotten your Ambien, I would highly recommend it. Start about an hour before you want to go to bed. So Moab, why is it called Moab? Well, it's actually named after Moab, Utah, because Richard Anderson was very fond of Moab, Utah. It is not an acronym. It is not a backronym. It does not stand for mother of all anything. It does not stand for many objects are broken. But what actually is it? Well, it is a versioned forward delta file structure that supports fixity and file deduplication. You can preserve absolutely anything with it, including pictures of cats from the internet. In terms of where Moab fits into the larger ecosystem, here we have a fairly, I think it should be a fairly familiar view for most of you, the management, access, and preservation layers of a fully formed preservation system. And Moab fits in down here. Here be Moabs, down in the preservation layer. I promised Rosie I'd do the voice for that. The tools to manage and create Moab apps are open source. They're available from the Stanford Library's GitHub repository. This is an actively maintained Ruby gem. It was fallow for a little while, but we've been doing some development recently, so this is all up to date to the latest versions of Ruby, and it's kind of cool. So if you're interested, check it out. It's a more interesting read than the actual code flip paper. Now, what does Moab actually look like in practice at Stanford? Well, we have, I have to read from here, 1.6 million Moab objects, about 5 million version directories, about 50+ million files, and about 500 terabytes, more than 500 terabytes worth of objects preserved on disk. In fact, we just got the stats for May the other day, and we ingested 25 terabytes last month. We use NFS mounts to store this data. We have about 15 NFS mounts on several NetApp filers. And then we back that up using IBM Spectrum Protect, formerly IBM TSM. So if I say TSM, I really mean Spectrum Protect. If you don't know what Spectrum Protect is, it is an enterprise class backup solution similar to Commvault or NetApp, not NetApp, NetBackup. And we write one copy to tape that we keep in the local frame, and we send a copy out to Iron Mountain somewhere else in the Bay Area. So we have a total of 3 copies of every object that we lay down in the SDR. So let's actually have a look at what a Moab looks like on disk. You see in the top left-hand corner here, we have the unique identifier of a particular Moab, a Druid. And that is the sort of the root directory for the Moab object. Underneath that, we have 2 version directories, which is pretty typical for a Moab. Inside those version directories, we have the data directory. This is where the upstream system, whatever that is, lays down whatever it is that it wants to preserve. We use a Fedora-based system, so we're looking at serialized XML streams for metadata and whatever the binaries are in the content directory. The meat of Moab is here in the manifests directory. There are really only two main files here that I'm concerned about, and that is the signature catalog file and the manifest inventory file. This is where all the checksums are stored. Manifest inventory stores the checksums for all the other files in that manifest directory, and signature catalog file stores the checksums for all files in the data directory for all versions up to that current version. This is one of the issues of Moab, is that if you want to find all the checksums that you need to perform a fixity check pass, you need to go into multiple files in multiple directories to get at it. So for, say, a Moab that's on version 7, you need to go into 8 different files. The manifest inventory file in every version directory and the most recent file catalog, file catalog file. And it's doable, but it's not so great. So what are our practical problems with Moab? Aside from the search for checksums, the manifest inventory file itself is not actually checksummed. We don't track it. So if you were a malicious actor and you were able to edit that manifest inventory file, you own that object and we would not be able to detect your meddling. So we identified this problem a while ago. We have fixed it, kind of, sort of. It'll be definitely fixed for sure in like a couple of months' time, but we have a fix that's going into production now to address that. But that's a pretty big flaw in Moab that we want to address with OCFL as well. What else? We have a somewhat, well, it's not parochial, it's fairly common requirement that the access layer needs instant access to archive object files. So that's usually the uncompressed TIFFs of stuff that's been served through our image server, for example. It gets that from the preservation layer. That prevents us from doing what we should be doing with these archive packets, which is making them into zip files, not compressed obviously, but making them into single archive packets and putting those someplace. Moab itself is not archive aware. Whilst you can take that version directory and make a zip out of it, there's nothing in the Moab spec that describes how you handle that zip, how you checksum it, how you move it around, how you discover what's in there. Also, because of this, because of the access level requirements, we have many, many, many tiny files spread across 15 NFS mounts, and they are a pain in the butt to back up with a commercial backup solution. IBM Spectrum Protect, almost said TSM there, will scan an NFS mount of 30 terabytes, every single file, compare every file that it finds against a record of that file in a database that it keeps back on the backup server to work out what it needs to back up. And when you're dealing with, on each mount, a couple of million 4K files, that's a really slow backup cycle. It used to take us 2 or 3 days to process one mount for backups. We ended up employing a feature of the NetApp, SnapDiff, to make that faster, but I believe that we shouldn't be relying on a vendor-specific hardware fix to be able to perform preservation activities. Finally, well, not quite so finally, IBM Spectrum Protect is surprisingly not cheap. Yes, tape itself is cheap, but all the infrastructure that surrounds a tape backup system at scale is not cheap, and frankly, I would like something cheaper. And finally, we need to make sure that the preservation system is aware of all copies that it is preserving. Right now, because of our use of TSM, there is a hard line in the sand that PresCore does not know about. It just lays down one copy on disk, and as far as our upstream systems are concerned, we have one copy of that Moab. Now, on the system side of things, we know we actually also have 2 copies on tape, but I believe that the preservation system should also be aware of that, know where it is, and know how to do things with those copies. Right, so now some hopes and dreams, what we would like to get out of OCFL. The first one is we would love a persistent entry point into an object that tells me exactly what's the latest version of this file, what checksums do I need to validate this file, and what is the most recent version. Right now, to get, say, with Moab, we have to go into multiple directories, we have to troll directories to work out what the most recent version directory is, go into that version directory, find the manifest inventory, get the head information from manifest inventory, and then reconstitute the file from there. It's not so great, works okay on a POSIX-based file system. That is definitely a suboptimal design pattern for an object store. You want to know, going into things, what is my key that I'm looking for? So if we can address that with OCFL, that would be great. We'd also like to have support for archive version files. Basically, take that version directory, make a zip of it, and then track it in a way that the preservation catalog can handle. Mm-hmm. Thank you. See, you're doing a good job. Good, yeah. But you're not going to do it for anyone else, but no, that's fine. We'd like to make sure that the preservation system is aware of all copies everywhere. Again, this is to break the whole IBM dependency. I think I said enough about that. And finally, we would like to allow for a non-disruptive migration from Moab to OCFL. The challenge there is that we cannot touch any of our existing Moab objects. Specifically, we cannot touch any of the existing version directories of those objects. So whatever we do, OCFL has to sit alongside or lay on top of our existing directory structure. All right, and now I think it's over to Don to tell us a little bit about Notre Dame.
Adjust this mic. Hello, does it work? Great. Hi, I'm Don Brower. I'm at Notre Dame. So our adventure in the storage and preservation storage started in 2015 when we retrofitted. We had an existing Hydra application, and we retrofitted a tape system kind of underneath it. So we had lots of requirements for this, and this is kind of like basically like a new thing. So we just made a and there's not too many things that we could find existing on this. So what we did is we just made basically a new system, and we wanted to have a general model that, because we were using Fedora 3, well, we still are using Fedora 3, but we anticipated back then going to Fedora 4, so we wanted a thing that was not like tied to any single repository model. So what we made is a, one second. So we made a system that essentially provides a generic data model. It provides a URL to each content item because we want to integrate this with our library systems, so we needed URL accessibility. We kept we got to stick the URL in Fedora data stream as an external data stream, so it works great. We also kept wanted the system to keep a cache of content that was on tape, so essentially like a poor man's tiered storage system, which has actually been fine. And then we also have the system that does like fixity checking for the thing. So when we were doing this, we were looking around for like the first thing was, what's the data model, or what should we do for this? And looking at existing systems, really the one that seemed that there was not too many like research or published articles on any of this. So, but the key one was this Moab, and we took many, we stole, well not stole, like we borrowed many key ideas from Moab, and it was actually it was brilliant. So and I can't actually see the slide here, so can I see it there? So this is the three things here. Like one of them is like a digital item is just a version directory of files. So this is a very general model. You can fit almost anything you want into this. We want that the content deduplication happens inside an item, which is good. Like if you have a video file, you update metadata, you don't want to have to make a new version with a copy of the video. But it's not global. And then, although I do know some people are working on global deduplication, I'm curious how that goes for you. And then the last one is that we wanted, oh, I can't even read it. So, oh yeah, sorry, yeah, the versioning does not happen file by file. It happens on the item together because what you care about is how everything is as a whole, and it makes it easier for you to even track version, because otherwise you would not know when versions change. So these were the key ideas for Moab, and we took them, but we didn't use Moab directly because which I'll get to in a little bit. So the logical view is a version directory of files, and this is a view we have just like a debugging interface that we have on our system because it was so here you have an item, it has a version, you have a list of files. The files are actually the pseudo directories, so we allow slashes in the file names, so kind of have directories. And for each file, we actually keep 2 hashes, and we keep and you can see in there like we serialize all the Fedora objects too into the file as well as the content files, the actual payload. So On disk, this is actually stored as a sequence of zip files because in our testing, we found the tape system hates lots of little files. So we try to aggregate things into zips, and this is probably the biggest point where we diverge from Moab because there's not an inherent notion of this chunking things into zip files. They're actually uncompressed zip files, and they're all in baget format. So the manifest essentially is checksummed, which is nice. And then since each individual file is a baget file, we can verify each one individually. And then we also do like an overall check to make sure that like we don't have a file copied in this given file does not exist in 2 baget files, or that like our general metadata makes sense consistently. So in general, we will make a new bag file either for a new version or if an existing bag file gets too large. And I don't remember what the cutoff is, but because we wanted to make sure retrieval from tape is relatively fast. So if one file gets too big and we can help it, we'll make it smaller. All right. So moving on, where we have some future concerns. So one of the biggest problem is that since we know the data will outlive the systems that we use to interact with it, is how we're always thinking about how we're going to migrate it in the future. And I always figured the future would be 5 or 10 years in the future, but now we actually have something coming up. The library recently merged with the archives about 2 years ago, and they themselves have their own digital files. So now we are exploring whether we can combine the preservation storage between the archives and the library. So and there's lots of concerns in there. So we're still storing that. We just started discussing this, but that means that we may have a migration sooner than we think involving all the files. And it would be nice if there's a way that we could do that, or we could migrate to a common management system or somehow, but not necessarily have to copy the files unnecessarily. So that's because you don't necessarily want to copy them unless you have to. And especially if they're like, right now the archives, they store their stuff on tape too, in a different partition. Do we really need to copy everything out of one tape partition just to put it back into the same tape system on a different partition? So anyway, this is one area where I hope OCFL can help a little bit if we can separate the actual storage from the management application. So thank you very much. And now
So, this is small. I see why you were leaning in, Don. Yeah. Yeah. So, Emory University. They are all so much taller than me. Can anybody see me? Over the last year and a half, Emory has been actively engaged in a requirements gathering effort for our forthcoming Samvera-based repository. As part of that effort, we had a mandate to make sure that we focused on digital preservation for the repository. It is a strategic initiative for the library, both the repository and digital preservation, so 2 separate initiatives. So when I write my annual report, I have to talk about it twice. So selected deliverables for that project included object definitions for types of objects, so things like collections, objects, agreements, that sort of thing, and how those would be preserved both inside and outside of Fedora. We also worked on identify the needs for an ape structure. So there's a link there. We'll put these slides in the notes. So if people want to look, that link leads to our wiki, and you can read through what our ape requirements are. Oh, right. Thank you. Identify storage requirements too. Right. Sorry. I wrote them a while ago. So for storage requirements, we actually use the preservation storage criteria, whittled that down to things that we felt as an institution were important for preservation purposes. Again, that'll link to the wiki, so if you want to follow that link, you're more than welcome to. I should say but I promised Julian I wouldn't say this too often. Prior to coming to Emory, I worked at Stanford, and I worked with Richard Anderson for his last couple of years at Stanford, and was very heavily influenced by his thinking, specifically around Moab, and how to handle preservation objects. I've only said his name once. So we're done. So writ large, though, with Emory's requirements gathering process, we've tried to keep things simple. We don't want to come up with 8 million different object models. We're looking to kind of keep a very low profile and make sure that our repository works for all the different types of content that we will put in it. And that includes scholarly communications content, as well as content for the special collections and archives. Whatever content people want to provide us, we want to make sure that we are really keeping it simple and standardized. That was one of the problems that we ran into in our previous homegrown, do-it-yourself, not working with the community repositories. So this is a very dumbed down of what our PCDM object structure would look like in the Samvera-based repository. So again, we're not really thinking about trying to make things complicated. We really want to simplify it. The same thing is also true for our ape structure. We've identified buckets of contents that depositors are interested in using. This, again, happened over 1.5 years of having conversations with various parts of the libraries. So we will, of course, have metadata, because you can't not have metadata, content files, and then supplemental preservation files. And so those supplemental preservation files are files that folks really want to include in the repository, but the repository isn't necessarily going to be able to read. So we're really trying to simplify things, make things as agnostic as possible, I guess is a good way to put it. We do have requirements around versioning. That is something that we recognize is necessary, and like Don and like Moab, we think that versioning is around the object itself. So if you are versioning metadata, you are versioning the object. If you're versioning or making changes to the file or replacing the file, you are changing the object. So that is one of the things that we are definitely thinking about when we're thinking about what our preservation system would look like. And Emory is about to embark on development, hopefully like soon, like maybe next month or the month after. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, who did not put this slide in. That was all Julian.
Okay, so now that you've heard everybody saying, oh, OCFL this, OCFL that, I'm here to actually tell you what it is. It's the Oxford Common File Layout, and our intention in structuring this session was to basically set up the need for this sort of community specification, that people are doing this sort of thing, but we're not doing it together, and we're not working and solving the same problems in the same way. So to set it up, there's this, everybody's doing digital content storage. Files are the heart of your repository. You are storing files if you're storing images, you're storing files if you're storing video, if you're storing OCR text. Everything is basically a file. And we can't forget that databases are files too. So at some level, your database is storing a file on a disk. So really, what you're looking at is layers of abstraction in your repository on top of files. So we have to sort of start from that. everybody's storing them in different ways. We've just heard 2.5 different ways, because Rosie's still working on it. But there's 2.5 different ways just up on stage. I'm sure there's, what, maybe 70 or 80 people here. There's probably 70 or 80 different ways, unless you're at the same institution, which we won't get into that. But everybody's storing them in different ways. Some are relying on their software, sort of just delegating it off. You know, oh, Fedora, you can do that, can't you? DSpace, hey. So some people are using their software solutions and not asking too many questions. Others are building their homegrown solutions, so the Moabs, the pseudo Moabs, everything like that. So they're doing that because they want to be able to migrate their content in application-independent ways. And what this means is that common practices and common tooling and best practices are difficult. So from a digital preservation perspective, I think Dawn maybe mentioned that, well, not this bit, that's the next point. So application migrations put your content at risk. So if you're moving your content from one application to another, your content is at risk because you're rewriting the structure, you're doing something else. Your files will outlast your current software. I think this is the point that Dawn made, was that your files will sit on your disk and your software on top will probably change more often than the files will. So we have to really take that into account. Change histories are rarely kept. Rosie hinted at this with versioning. Versioning isn't something that a lot of pieces of software really think about and how to structure their change histories. Requiring a database to make sense of your files is risky. I get a bit cringy when I see, oh, I've got this file system of just checksums and checksum named files, and that's okay because my database will actually make sense of that for me. It probably won't at some point. This is my personal feeling, but we should be standardizing on specs and not software. We should not be requiring everybody in the room to be running the same piece of software in order to standardize what we're doing. So that's sort of the point of the OCFL is to build a spec where we can standardize on how the software applications can build it, can store data, but we're not actually requiring you to run a specific piece of software. Our origin story, so basically the origin story was that I was a pain in the butt to Andrew Woods at the Fedora camp in Oxford in September 2017, where I was talking to him about the need for Fedora specifically to abstract out its content store in a way that we could build services around that. So between Andrew Woods and I, we sort of came up with this last fall, and then we sort of engaged people last December. In terms of the name, Oxford should be read the same as Portland for PCDM or Dublin for Dublin Core, and it's just the place where the idea came up. Where it's not Oxford specific. I'm up here as Oxford, somebody from the University of Oxford, and we need this too, but it's not sort of like Oxford's things that they're sharing with everybody. It's sort of the place name for it. Our working definitions, we just came up with this 2 days ago, so if you have feedback, let us know. But OCFL is an application-independent specification that describes the storage of OCFL objects in a structured, transparent, and predictable manner. And then an OCFL object is a group of one or more bit streams and their administrative information that together have a URI. An object may contain a sequence of versions of the bit streams that together represent an intellectual endeavor. And what you'll sort of get out of this is that it's fairly generic, and we're not saying what you put into these things. It's just a way of managing the files on your disk. So I sort of drew this up to contrast it to some of the other ways that people are working on this, is that in this case, we have sort of an application layer managing the storage layer, and then we have an API on top of that. And from my perspective, where I see the problem with this is that you have this monolithic gateway for all of your services to have to go through in order to access your storage layer. And so I kind of call this a proprietary structure. because there's only one application that can actually make sense of this. So in OCFL, we wanted an application-independent file structure, which basically is file layout as API. Repositories can be rebuilt or migrated across them, so you don't, it's not application, because it's not application specific, you can sort of put one application and then another one on top of it. And that we're trying to work for traditional file storage as well as for cloud object storage. So in a way, this is sort of what I'm thinking of it, where you have multiple apps that can write or read to the storage layer, and then the API tools, which are basically you can write your own, or you can have OS utilities to do that for you. And then underneath of that, you can have a validatable structure for your file system. So you can write a validator to say, all of the stuff in my file system conforms to this spec, and you can sort of share that validation status. So there are two main parts for OCFL that we've identified. The first is the actual file layout. So the first is the file layout, so object root, and we have some basic structure here. I won't get too much detail because we're still fleshing it out. And then we have sort of an inventory file that will track the changes to that and let you make sense of all of your versioning. Details are forthcoming on this stuff. So what it is not is anything to do with low-level file systems. We're not touching XFS, NTFS, X3. We're not talking about S3 or Azure or anything like that. That's out of scope. It's not an attempt to standardize the digital object, so we're not specifying that you must use METS or MARC or Dublin Core or any sort of binary format. So it's agnostic at that level. And it's not really a software project, although we'll be developing software to conform to the spec. Where we are now, so we have an editorial team of these fine people, and where the minutes are held. We have monthly community calls, so you can join us here, and use case gathering. So we're collecting use cases. And our roadmap going forward is that we're basically in the process of soliciting broad feedback from the community. We are writing and refining the specification at the moment, so we're sort of duking it out. We will be creating some test cases, so how we verify that we are conforming to the spec, and then develop a validator software, so a reference implementation for the spec. So those are the 4 major milestones in the roadmap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. We're going to do questions now. Let me turn this off. Yes, and pass that back and forth. All right, who's got questions? Who wants to see a fat man run around a big room? There we go. Back corner, awesome. Somebody over there, get ready. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, so thanks for all the presentations. This is great. I have a question that I always struggle with a little bit conceptually. These are all our object-based modelings with varying degrees of support for versioning. How do you approach using that kind of model for resources that are dynamic, things that are constantly evolving and growing, like maybe data sets, like social media data sets, for example? Thanks.
So I've actually had this conversation with my Center for Digital Scholarship because their projects are constantly changing and constantly growing. And what I've said to them is there are moments where you take a breath with your projects, right? So it may be that you do the work and then the faculty member has to work on tenure, right? And that may be a moment where you've taken a breath, or you have a grant that you've worked on and the grant ends, and that's a moment where you're taking a breath. And for those types of projects, what I have suggested that they do is that that's the moment that we create a new version. Sure, there's been a lot of work during the grant writing process, or during when the grant was running, or during the time that the professor had like 200 students working on the thing, right? But those breath moments are the moments that we should take stock of the object, because that really is just an object. Figure out how to preserve it, and there's a variety of conversations that we can get into on the side about how to do that. Preserve the object, and then wait for the next breath, right? So wait for the next moment where enough work has happened, but we're at a good stopping point, and it's time to take a snapshot of that object again. Does that make sense?
Hi, I may have missed it, but can you tell what support there is for project-specific path names and organization within a given object? So if you have a data set where it has thousands of files, and the organization of those files within the scope of that data set is significant, might be even using another model that's discipline specific. Does the data section of your storage model support then an arbitrary organization below that level?
In the structure, there's a V1, so version 1 folder. The intention for us is that it is completely agnostic underneath, so you can structure your content in any way that you want inside of the object. We're not sort of specifying that you must have a data folder and a metadata folder, although if you're Julian, you might want to do that, but that's not part of the spec. So you can do whatever you want in there, and it's basically the OCFL object outside is just trying to manage those transitions between here's my first version, here's my second version, here's my third version. Yeah.
Follow-up question, how do you, there was mention about how you avoid redundancy and duplication between versions. Are your diffs forward or backward facing, meaning does the latest version have all of the files, or is it like SVN where you have to start from the beginning and start building up the final version and the collection of files across versions?
Yes, we do a bit of both. So each version folder will only contain the changes from the previous one, but in our inventory, we're also going to try and store a snapshot of what the object looked like at that point in time. So you can, within the inventory, you can resolve all previous things by just looking at the latest version or the version or any given version. It'll just be a big JSON array with all the versions. So you can say, I want version 3, I might be on version 10, but here's what it looked like here, and then I can resolve the file paths from all the other versions. So we're trying to sort of walk a path. It is forward deltas, but we're trying to not have you do what they do in Moab, which is read everything previously. But we're trying to sort of make that a bit more efficient.
Other questions?
But my question is just about the version numbering. So you're just sequentially deciding this is version 2, this is version 3. How, like, should that not be a date maybe, or what's the correspondence between the version number and the actual date at which time this change took place?
So do you mind if in the inventory, we will store a date stamp for when we created a version, and we're currently in discussion among the editors of how we're actually referencing that. So there will be a date stamp that there was a version created at this point. What the folder name is that you actually store it, we're still working that out, whether you can define it yourself or whether we have a specified pattern for that. we'll have to run through the use cases and figure out if we what we do for there. But the intention is that we date stamp it in the inventory, and then we back the inventory up at subsequent changes so that you can roll back to previous inventories as well.
Can I also add too, some of us on the editorial team have different understandings of what a version would be. And so I don't think that we will be able to come to a compromise. I really do like Julian though. And so I think at some, at some respect, I don't think that we will, and I'm going out on a limb here, I don't think we're gonna say like, you have to version when you do this. Because I don't know if we'll be able to come up with that compromise. Yeah, so.
Hi, I was wondering, you're creating a new specification to try and cure some ills that you've had with previous attempts to create this kind of file. How do you plan to, once you've specified this, to test your design to make sure that it's really, curing the ills that you've had in the past, and to ensure that it's worth all the trouble that you've taken to create this?
Well, I've got 500 terabytes of stuff that I'm going to try it on. That's the glib answer. We've already identified many of these weaknesses in Moab. So we were going to be doing something with Moab anyway that's going to look awfully like OCFL. My hope is that we'll do this in parallel, and as we develop OCFL, we'll be developing the tooling so that Moab can keep pace with this. And so we will have a huge corpus of data that we'll be testing this against. Not making destructive changes, obviously. So hopefully we will know. It'll take long enough for us to develop this. We'll have enough detail that we'll correct the known failures and not introduce new ones. That's the plan. It'll go perfectly. Plans always do.
I think also what the plan in the roadmap is to use, well, first of all, we're seeking broad consultation. So we're trying to capture all of the failures and the successes of other people. The second thing is that we're developing test cases. So we'll be developing, Rosie will give us one of her structures and we'll say, okay, well, does it work with this? And then a piece of software that will validate those structures. So a validator, I think, will be one of the key pieces of the whole initiative to say, yes, you conform to the spec. And the spec actually contains all the best practices that we've been able to gather. So I don't think it'll be perfect from version 1, but I think it'll be, hopefully, with broad consensus and broad input, it will be the best that everybody in the room basically has come up with so far.
Yeah, exit stage left.
Let's bring up the new group. Hannah and crew, we're going to talk about issues around collections as data. Hannah Frost from Stanford and Sarah Pot. Look at this. Do it properly. I know. Puffin from Texas A&M will set the stage for the panel. Panelists Helen Bailey of MIT, Mark Jordan of Simon Fraser, and Kate Lynch of University of Pennsylvania will each describe observations and lessons learned from their work in making collections as data. And again, we'll close with a brief panel discussion where the audience will have a chance to ask questions. Good?
Good. Would you mind grabbing that laptop?
Wouldn't mind at all.
Okay. So before we get started, I'm aware that the live stream does not display the slides. So if you want to follow along, I have a link that I can spell out for you out there, live world. bit.ly/collections as data capital O, capital R 2018. Hope that works. Yeah. Okay, good. My name is Hannah Frost, Stanford Libraries, as Declan said. I'm here representing both Sarah and I. We organized this panel. And we invited Helen Bailey of MIT, Mark Jordan of Simon Fraser, and Kate Lynch to join us. I'm just going to set up the stage here, literally, with a few minutes of introduction about our project. So Sarah and I are members of the team working on the project known as Always Already Computational Collections as Data, an effort generously supported by the IMLS, yay! We have a grant under the National Leadership Grants for Libraries program. Thank you very much, IMLS, for your support. So now in its second year, the project has set out to learn how researchers work with cultural heritage collections using computational methods, and to better understand how libraries, archives, and museums can do better to support this growing demand. It's imperative that we accommodate the users who are not being served effectively by the traditional lockdown interfaces so common to cultural heritage institutions' digital presence. What are the kinds of things that these researchers need in order to work with collections as data? From what we've heard, they require the ability to operate in bulk, all kinds of operations, access to open, well-documented APIs, efficient data transfer to and from content management systems, full text access, unambiguous rights statements and licenses, deeper indexing and enhanced discovery, and lots more clear documentation on how these collections were prepared and processed in order to be made available as data. If Sarah and I had more time today to provide additional background, we'd tell you about the other conference sessions, workshops, and 2 invitational forums that the team convened. And we'd tell you about the growing number of resource materials gathered, produced, and assembled through our work. Resources such as the Santa Barbara Statement and the user personas. And if you're looking for evidence that collections as data is a growing trend, I point you to our Zotero library, which has over 190 items in it and counting. You can find all of this stuff on our website. Another of our project outputs available on the sites are called facets, not to be confused with the navigational aids on search interfaces that we commonly see these days. Our facets are essentially case studies that document collections as data implementations, in effect offering on-the-ground guidance and demonstrating that the implementations are as diverse as the institutions and professionals who've worked on them. It shows that there isn't a standard prescription for this work. 2 of the projects represented on the panel today, OPEN and MIT's thesis and dissertation effort, are also documented and posted as facets. Along the way, we've engaged with librarians, technologists, archivists, museum professionals, researchers, practitioners such as journalists and public data advocates, and others who identify with any of these roles. And all of these folks and working at these institutions have contributed to and advanced our work. We're really grateful for that. It's worth highlighting the separate but parallel effort that the Library of Congress has been undertaking to surface the issues and explore the opportunities that rise out of thinking about collections as data. They produce these cool posters. In the Next Generation Repositories report published last year by CORE, and I've already heard reference several times at the conference already, half of the recommended repository behaviors in this report relate to supporting collections as data modes of working. These behaviors are consistent with the functional requirements that our team has gathered to. Which brings us to today's panel. We've been eagerly anticipating this opportunity to focus specifically on the role of repositories in supporting collections as data. While the challenges of collections as data are overall socio-technical, there are some purely technical barriers to delivery that remain significant and may be rooted in competing goals around repositories. So we ask, how are efforts to make collections accessible as data supported by repositories, or not, as the case may be? What are their gaps, and how do we plan to close them? So that's the point of the panel today. We hope that this is the first of many conversations in the repository community and at OR specifically for years to come. So I'm going to invite Helen Bailey to the podium.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Is it still morning? Just barely. I'm Helen Bailey. I'm a member of the software engineering team at MIT Libraries. And before I get started, I just want to put out the standard disclaimer. Opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not represent the MIT libraries at large. You will see why. So, let me start by jumping backwards a few years and just to set the stage for the two projects I'm going to talk about. MIT libraries have been receiving regular and increasing requests for API access to collections and/or collection dumps for text and data mining purposes for many, many years. These requests span collections content and format types, unique materials, vendor-provided materials. Basically, if it's part of our collections, the MIT community wants to do computational analysis on it. So 3 years ago-ish, all we had really done in this area was create a LibGuide to help users understand what APIs were available to them and how to use them. Unfortunately, at that time, API access to collections was available only for specific, really limited sets of materials, generally through vendor agreements that many of which had what I would frankly characterize as egregious terms of use that severely limited our users' ability to do the kind of research they needed to do. Also, and this is really important, just like everyone else in library land, we had technical debt. Our unique flavor of that is that our institutional repositories run on several instances of a very old version of DSpace that has been significantly modified with custom code and workflows and is thus difficult to upgrade. So about 2 years ago, knowing that it would be a while before we'd be able to upgrade DSpace, we started a couple of projects to explore making our unique collections available in more data mining friendly ways. And the first one I'm going to talk about was our Fedora text and data mining project, which we cleverly called the Fedora TDM project because naming is hard. This had two goals. One was to explore the Fedora platform. We have been a DSpace shop since the beginning of DSpace, so we were interested in learning more about Fedora 4 and what it could do. And the second goal was to explore providing our users with API access to the MIT thesis collection. We chose the thesis collection because it's a decent size, it has 30 or 40,000 items, but it's not so big that we were going to run into issues. And it's a very high demand collection, particularly for data mining. The MIT theses and dissertations are on the cutting edge of research in many fields, so people are super interested in mining them to identify new research trends. So we got started and we built the thing. We used Fedora 4 for object and metadata storage and retrieval. We had Elasticsearch for indexing and search, a REST API service with endpoints that we built for documents, some predefined collections, user-defined document sets, and then document set archives that would allow users to retrieve a previously defined document set for citation and reproducibility. This also had a very lightweight website with instructions, documentation, and a little bit of search result visualization, but no document browsing at all. We decided early on in the project to deploy these services in Kubernetes, which is an open source cloud container orchestration system originally developed by Google. And this is where the project kind of started to go off the rails. So at the time, we had no DevOps staff. We had a very, very small percentage of one sysadmin's time on this project, and our development team had zero prior experience with Kubernetes. So now on top of testing out a new repository platform and a new service model, we were also learning an entirely new deployment landscape that is pretty confusing. So the project ultimately failed. And in my opinion, it failed for a number of reasons. First, it had two big conflicting goals. The goal of exploring Fedora as the base repository system was super valuable. We learned a whole lot from that experience. We learned a lot about Fedora. We learned a lot about what repositories are like in the modern world. It was great. The goal of building an API service for end users was also super valuable, and we learned a lot from that. Unfortunately, it turns out that exploring a platform's technical capabilities and building a production user-facing service have different technical and management requirements. Who knew? So we ended up with a system that did not fully achieve either goal. Second, we discovered in user interviews during the project that the #1 priority for all users, more important than method of data access, ability to query the data set, create subsets for download, the ability to do any kind of analysis or visualization, the absolute #1 thing they wanted was good, clean, full text data. So about that. We have digitized historical theses where some of the date ranges have terrible OCR, and we have a huge percentage of PDFs that were generated by the students before submission from LaTeX editors, where the text was incorrectly encoded in the PDF, and thus we have either no full text or gibberish full text. These are largely solvable problems, but we weren't able to address them within the scope of the project, which is unfortunate because from the user perspective, that turned out to be the most important thing. And finally, the other big mistake we made was in using Kubernetes, not because there's anything wrong with it. We really wanted to explore automated cloud deployment, but we jumped the gun with it on a project where we didn't have the ops support allocated to make it successful. And this meant that our goal of learning more about the Fedora was kind of thwarted. So we ran into performance issues really quickly, and we just didn't have the capacity and expertise to figure out whether they were Fedora issues or Kubernetes issues or some combination of the two. So our inability to manage and support that Kubernetes cluster was ultimately what killed the project. And when I say killed, I mean you haven't seen any screenshots from this service because we don't have any. After 9 months of work, we decided to pull the plug and burn the whole thing down, which was a really good decision. And we learned so much in that 9 months. We learned a lot about the state of our thesis collection. We learned a whole lot about writing APIs for collection access. We learned what services our users want from us for collections mining, and we wrote some code for harvesting theses from our current DSpace instance that has already been reused in other projects. So not a waste of time. And we've been doing other things that are maybe slightly more obvious successes. So concurrently with the TDM project, we built Backrest, which is an API backport to replicate current DSpace REST API functionality in older versions of DSpace. That backport allowed us to work with vendors who use the DSpace API, and we were able to start migrating workflows to API-based processes that would facilitate our inevitable upgrade to a newer DSpace version. Backrest is a Java application with a Docker image. It's super easy to run, and it's available via our MIT Libraries GitHub. So if on the off chance there are other people also running older versions of DSpace out there somewhere, just FYI, this exists. Also, we made some good decisions on this project. So we did it for vendor access, but this amazing side effect that we didn't really think of, honestly, at the beginning, is that now we have read-only REST API access to our entire set of collections in DSpace, everything we have in DSpace, without any change to the system itself or the collections in it. And at MIT, a REST API is something our users get. So this was a cool sort of example of finding a way to work from where we are rather than waiting for this looming upgrade to start doing interesting things with our collections. And then, what are we doing next? So we're upgrading DSpace, yay! We also have a project to clean up the full text content of our thesis collection. We have, in 2016, MIT Libraries released this Future of the Libraries report, which envisions that all MIT Libraries collections will be provided via an open global platform that allows users to query, access, use, recreate, and build on top of our collections. So we're moving forward to build decoupled API-driven services to support that vision, ideally repository agnostic, which means that we're taking an API-first approach to service engineering both for internal and external applications. One project that's involved in this is a central metadata index to support API access across all of our repositories and collections. And super important, this vision includes a strong user base that is actively building tools analyses, visualizations, and new data sets on top of our collections, which we recognize is not just magically going to happen if we build a bunch of APIs for them. So we're exploring collaborations both internal and external to MIT to make sure that we're building the platform so that it's usable and useful to our user community. That's our story of trying to provide collections as data in our existing environment and reality, learning a few lessons along the way. And now you get to hear from some folks who have done maybe some more straightforwardly successful implementations, starting with Mark.
Just this. So I'm going to share with you 3 examples of how specific libraries are providing collections as data to their communities. First one is from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands. This one and the next one are both examples of collections as data from Islandora repositories. The third one is a completely bespoke platform that I'll describe in more detail at that point. So this is an interesting example because the users of this data are very focused and they know what they want. What they want to do is they want to train software for AI or other kinds of applications. So downloading the collections locally for use in those applications is a pretty clear use case. What the MPI is doing is they're having users log in to their Islandora repository. The user then selects a collection that they want to download, and then that collections data is zipped up into multiple archive files, say zip files. When that process is done, the user gets an email saying, come and get your zip files. They download them and they do their work. This is an interesting way of doing this because it's kind of like zip up on demand as opposed to having the stuff all zipped up, waiting to be downloaded, then needing to be updated for the smallest change and consuming all sorts of crazy disk space that doesn't need to be consumed. This is not yet in production, not because the technology is not ready, it's because they just haven't finished their migration to Islandora yet organizationally. And the modules that make this happen are available for any Islandora 7 site to use, developed by Discovery Garden. I want to acknowledge information and help from Paul Trilsbeck at MPI, and if you have any questions, you can come through me and I can contact Paul for you, or his email address is there on the screen. This is just a snapshot of kind of a conventional Islandora kind of collection browse, but they would have a link next to each collection to initiate the process of zipping it up and having it downloadable. The next tool or example is from my own institution, Simon Fraser University. Again, this is not in production, not because the technology is not ready, it's because we haven't developed a service around it. But we do want to develop a real service around it, and that is to allow people to download collections for their use and potentially let them develop their own little tool set around that process that will let them customize how that is downloaded and at the same time introduce them to basic software programming skills. So this is a tool you download onto your laptop. It doesn't take the same model that the MPI did, where you just ask for the downloadable zip files. This one, you download a tool, you get to choose which collection or collections you want to download. You run the tool, you do it, and I'll just walk through that a little bit more for you. We do want to put a graphical user interface on this, and we do want to also provide platform-specific binaries for Mac OS and Linux to do that. So you run the tool, fetch collection. It's a script at this point, a Python script. Again, we do want to put a GUI on top of that. And the clear and unambiguous rights statements that were mentioned. This is something that I just made up on my laptop. This is not what we're going to use. What we'll have to do is run this by the University Copyright Officer to make sure that we're not violating anything. But basically, user accepts that or doesn't accept it. They get a menu, and you can imagine this, please, as a graphical user interface application, not as a Python script. But they get a list of all the collections in our repo. This is just the first 7. They choose one, in this case, number 7, the Bill Read collection. They specify where they want to download it. When that process is done, they get this. This is the raw Islandora. This is just like the data streams from Islandora, the files in an object. Each directory is an object, Bill Read 1, Bill Read 10, and so forth. without any kind of customized or finessed file names and all that. The idea that I mentioned a minute ago about being able to customize how this is done will be done through what we're calling plugins. So the user may not like this, and I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't like this. They could write a plugin to name the various files more usefully for their own application. The manifest CSV at the bottom is produced by a plugin now, and that is just a list of all of the objects that have been downloaded with their URLs and some other information. And that is also produced by a plugin, so you get the idea that plugins not only apply to manipulating files and file names and directory structures, but also to doing other things during the download process that the user might find useful. The third and last example is from the University of British Columbia, just across town from where I work at Simon Fraser University. They have a couple of repository platforms. They run ContentDM and DSpace. And what they've done is develop what they call Open Collections, which is a kind of a central aggregation service where they provide other services to researchers and the community. And it implements IIIF, DOI, blah, blah, blah. They also provide an end user API so that researchers can download content themselves. And here I want to thank my colleagues Paul Joseph and Bronwyn Sprout from UBC for providing this information. These examples, there's 3 examples here from Open Collections. The top two are local, like they're eating their own dog food locally. They're providing maps in these 2 cases, using data from, I think in both cases, ContentDM, supplementing it at the service level, and providing the interactive maps that we see here. The third one is at the bottom where it says recent theses and dissertations. That is using Open Collections API to produce a list of recent theses submitted, but on the Office of Graduate Studies website. So it's not the library eating its own dog food, it's another campus unit eating the dog food. And that's all I have to show you.
Thanks. Right. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. Oh, there's my notes. My name is Kate Lynch. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, as Hannah mentioned. So representing Penn Libraries in the Collections as Data project, we have OPEN, submitted by Porter, documented in the project as a data implementation facet. OPEN is a system designed and maintained by my colleague Doug Emery with instrumental design thinking by Dot. It's designed to present open access materials with as few barriers of entry as possible for allowing users to get at the data. It's self-described as reducing friction for access to first quality data, doing so by presenting the highest quality TIFF images of open access materials, largely medieval manuscripts and early print materials such as diaries, and providing multiple ways to get at the data. Users can access files on OPEN using tools and protocols such as rsync, wget, anonymous FTP, and even just downloading or straight linking from HTTP. And here it is. It's a standard standalone application. Back in 2013, the libraries hired Doug Emery, and not having a repository system in place and still in the process that many institutions found themselves in at the time of not really knowing where to start, yet with greenfield repository development, it made more sense for them to start from scratch using Doug's access model. At its heart, the software is essentially a lightly themed Apache directory listing. You can see at the top here, there are some readmes and technical tips. And the readmes describe the methods by which objects, file name, and metadata are uniformly structured. Each object has been packaged in a standardized format conceived of by Dot and Doug to make access patterns predictable, making coding or accessing via any of these protocols that much easier. And object access looks something like this. You can pay attention to the URL path in the browser at the top there, and you can see that it's literally just walking the file system. So you can open these directories up and get at the TEI XML payload in the browser right away. You can access first-run TIFFs, downloading them, and doing what you want to do from there. We now also have Calenda, our Samvera-based repository. Back in 2016, Penn Libraries hired me to, among other things, work as their primary repository developer for a Samvera-based repository solution, and from there Calenda was born. It favors long-term preservation of everything that goes in using a pluggable architecture and storage layer that tightly tracks version changes over time and values redundancy in the storage. Now, Calenda being our digital repository, what's in scope to go in is essentially anything in need of long-term preservation at Penn Libraries. This includes all of the objects currently in OPEN. You'll in fact see quite a few of the manuscripts that are in OPEN in Calenda currently. Also, Calenda being a repository, it includes development of features that are repository level enhancements. Things like persistent opaque identifiers, AAAF protocol implementation, Glacier for cold storage, non-image based object support, and so on. Features that are not in scope for OPEN because they wouldn't be suitable for that particular tool. And here's Calenda. Those of you familiar with Samvera or any blacklight-based front end are just going to look pretty familiar. And while methods of access for the front end user in this are pretty simple, there is a lot going on under the hood with these objects. As I mentioned, they're being stored in preservation level storage and versioned for long term. We're serving up AAAF info files and displaying in a AAAF compliant image viewer, as you can see, and so on. And so the two systems are currently implemented something like this. We have OPEN, which has its own storage in the form of a series of direct storage arrays mounted directly to the OPEN server. And that's where the files on OPEN are coming from. And then we have Calenda, which as a completely separate application, doing all of the preservation tasks I just described, and doing so with its own separate cloud-based storage. As applications, they're siloed from one another, and they contain duplicate copies of the objects. So what we're moving toward is a pattern more like this, where OPEN becomes another way to access data stored in our repository, building out a series of workflows so that Calenda can support a secondary interface exposing selected repository content for access across multiple familiar protocols such as wget and rsync, but more mimicking those protocols as methods by which objects are stored and referenced in preservation level software typically don't favor making it super easy to get at a bunch of your preservation level assets. OPEN is unique in this non-standard form of access really being the user promise here. So I'm going to, this is the part I've been nervous about. I have to jump to, I have a video of a demo that I've written in code. It's a small Sinatra-based application showing what this would look like. So pulling objects from our repository, there we go. So this is Calenda, our repository, and I'm just gonna call up a single object. This is the dev instance. We have way more in here, I promise. And just showing this is what it looks like in Calenda. So we've got the access level JPEG, and you can see it in the AAAF compliant viewer. And then going back over to the OPEN demo, we're going to be able to access both the access level JPEG, and we're going to start downloading the preservation level TIFF. So it's important to note that the files that we're downloading here and that we're looking at in the browser, the JPEG we're about to look at, and the XML file we're looking at as well, these are behaving as if they're just sitting on the file system like an Apache directory listing, but they're sitting in our block level intentionally opaque storage. And there's a piece of middleware that I've written here that is sort of handling these requests and giving protocols such as HTTP. And in a moment you'll see I'm going to be showing off wget as well, letting these tools get the responses that they expect. So there's the preservation level TIFF. I'm going to zoom in to show how preservation level it is. I think that's enough. Okay. And so in addition to HTTP, I'm going to demonstrate here, there's how you could use wget. So just issuing a standard wget command with whatever flags. In this case, I don't want any redundant directories. I just want the JPEGs out of this particular directory at this file path via HTTP. And I just get what I expect to get. And there they are on that bottom there. I like to demonstrate with the cursor. And there's the JPEG, and I'm going to zoom in to show that it's the slightly more pixelated access level iris JPEG. Yeah. Okay. What'd I do? That's my desktop. That's your. Sorry. Okay. Cool. Oh, phew. Okay. That was the part I was nervous about. Okay. So what this new method of access will also provide is the ability for objects stored and accessed in OPEN to potentially take advantage of additional data about objects that's offered in Calenda. So for instance, I mentioned that we have IIIF implemented in Calenda. The JSON information is available there, but it would be necessary to create manifests or serve through other viewers. So you could imagine people being able to discover objects in open, and open providing methods by which you get back to Calenda-based information, such as that information. And in our next steps, we're looking at the implications of this sort of access. So one thing that Mark Jordan inquired about early on when I was showing this group an early version of that demo was essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, hey, what about rights and access? I mean, surely not everything in a repository you want to have downloadable by the user this way. And I was like, yes, and everything in open has to be open access in order for it to be included in that platform. So check, I don't have to worry about it. And in fact, that's a pretty superficial check, obviously. But what that means is we have to be careful when we're implementing connections between Calenda and open, because Calenda needs to be able to support a variety of access levels and selectively open up access to content open style. This also highlights the importance of the relationship between Calenda's object and open's. Calenda's only method of discovery for the time being is the front-end discovery layer, which provides a lot of context for the full objects there. In opening up objects discovery through Calenda or open or another distillation of the object via information harvested from open, we just have to be mindful of what the risks are for users discovering parts of the object out of context and pay attention to appropriately asserting relationships between the two systems to prevent confusion about where to find canonical representations of the object or whether a representation you're seeing in the wild is incomplete. And finally, for obvious reasons, the software-based approach of the current implementation of open with Apache and a file system, while simple and elegant in granting you so much access, is not sustainable or highly replicable at other institutions. But it's not about the software, it's about the service that it represents. Now that we have a repository, we could simply say that we're migrating everything from open to the repository and that's it. But that would not express the value for the collections of content, the data that they represent both discretely and as individual units of information, subsets in the form of intellectual groupings, or as a whole. It's the service, not the software, and our goal is to introduce the benefits of a digital repository crafted for long-term preservation into a series of services for this unique form of broad access.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hello, thanks for the presentation. I really liked your demo, you crushed it. For the panel in general, how important for this kind of access is marking up the full text so that it's machine readable out of the box? And if it's, if it is very important, how do we get there? Like for instance, with the theses and dissertations, how do we go back and mark up all that text so that it is machine readable and that it's like, available in that way? Thank you.
I'll just say that in the conversations I've had with users in the MIT community, it really depends. The vast majority of folks we talked to didn't care about markup. They were fine with a PDF, they were fine with plain text, they just wanted the text. But I think it really depends on your community and what kind of research they're doing.
I guess I can speak a little bit to the open user community. It's important that the objects in open be predictably named and structured so that computational modes of access could get large swaths of things. But we also want to target people who are using things like spreadsheets to munge data and get at the information. So it's not necessarily machine readable, more just predictable, I think, is the importance there.
I'll just add also that they did absolutely want all of the structured metadata along with all of the full text.
And that reflects across what we've been hearing in the always already computational collections as data project in terms that it depends answer is really exactly it in terms of what the user community is asking for and what sort of requests people are hearing.
Other questions?
So one of the questions that we get asked a lot is what is the context that we're providing this data in? And as simple as the OCR is a good question. There are accuracy measures that have historically gone with OCR. Whether those accuracy measures are accurate is another question. But how are you thinking about framing and providing context when you do provide the bulk data?
So I mentioned that we haven't, at Simon Fraser University, the second example I show, we haven't really released this as to the public yet because we're still thinking about the service that we'd wrap around it. And our current repository provides context for each collection, one or more, typically one page, linking off potentially to other pages or whatnot. In the context of that tool that I showed, though, it specifically takes that it takes it out of that context, right? Because you download it and do something on your laptop. So I'm just imagining now that you could, prompt ask the user, do you want to know more about this collection? I mean, if they chosen a collection from a menu, they presumably know something about it already. Like that's probably reasonable to assume. But we could provide, especially in the context of a nice graphical user interface, we could go fetch the information from the repository, bring it back, show it in the interface, and kind of provide that context in a secondary fashion at the point of use.
Yeah, and one of the things just to follow up that I'm really interested in is how you make that part of that machine readable too. So if I have a lot of data and I'm running programs through it, are there other fields that, and I think, the mention about the structured metadata, but what other information can I pull to inform that set and not have to have a human go look at it or read it or go to a GUI?
I'll just say that we thought about this really hard in our project as it became clear that we had so many text encoding issues, and we ultimately decided to create a metadata field for text quality, but we tried to make it really simple. So we effectively, we did a lot of internal analysis of the quality of the plain text, and we kind of settled on terrible, okay, seems great. I don't remember what the exact terms were that we used, but we included that in the structured metadata that was provided to the users. And in fact, we gave them an option when sending the query, if they only wanted a certain threshold of text quality, they could include that in their request.
Other questions? We have time for one or two more, I believe. Oh, thanks.
My question, I guess, is specifically for about pen sound and to Kate, I guess. I really like your presentation a lot. It was great, and I'm wondering about community outreach to these collections. This happens to be a very an amazing audio digital collection at Penn. Do you have plans to sort of try and engage these external to library collections?
So you're talking about some audio collections that are not yet in the repository, or that would be in the
well, it's actually Penn Sound is this very large digital archive of audio, but it's hosted kind of outside of the library, and which can happen. These research collections that don't necessarily reside at the library now, but are in need of exactly this type of interoperable access. Yeah.
So I don't know as much about Penn Sound as it sounds like you do. I'll speak about what I do know though, and we do deal with some folks at Penn who have at-risk materials that could potentially benefit from our work. And I think that one method of outreach would absolutely be finalizing this work and having OPEN as a method of access to things in the repository, because it shows the repository not just as a stronghold to hold and protect materials, but also a place where people can computationally get at information and use it for research purposes and things that in the past maybe repositories don't quite do. And so that can be a reason why stuff doesn't go in the repository right away. So just like making people aware of what we're doing.
We have time for one more. Oh, good. Altitude's killing me.
Hi. First, I want to really commend you for this idea of opening the repositories up. This is something that I find super refreshing. So just that idea, just by itself, I want to. So then another suggestion, and especially listening to your MIT, I think, limitations, etc. Have you ever have the group thought, so the idea, I think it's opening up and having the user, the availability of being able to download these, massive amounts of data. So have you ever thought about using national open science computational resources free for use for the national community, such as through Exceed, for example, and that you can use to prototype these type of architectures, collection architecture, so to speak, and implement workflows or implement, like you said, the containers, and maybe implement some tools for data mining, etc., whatever you need. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the infrastructure is available, but also they have a program that is called ECSS, that is extended support. And so for somebody like your situation at MIT, that you have knowledge, computational knowledge, you will get also some support, 25% of the time of an expert in cloud computing, working with you on your project. So this is just to, you go to Exceed, it's a National Science Foundation cyber infrastructure. That would be something to think about, because downloading the files right there, that's a problem. So they have tools and resources, cloud computing, that you could use on your projects. Just this is a suggestion. But I really appreciate what you're doing.
Any reaction?
Just thank you for the suggestion, and also I will just say that we learned our lesson from that project. We have DevOps now.
We have 3 more minutes or lunch. What do you want to do?
I actually can't remember if I've asked you this before, Helen, but I know that there's a lot of institutions that get their dissertations and theses coming from LaTeX. And so we all have this problem if we want to open up those collections. So have you explored great ways of cleaning up that stuff, or do you have any advice, or how should we start?
Not yet. We do have a project that is exploring that, and I am working on it, so I'll let you know. One of the things we encountered early on in researching this was that we had actually, not we the libraries, we the MIT student community had provided a LaTeX thesis template that many students were using that incorrectly encoded all ligatures in PDFs. So roughly 30% of our thesis collection has incorrectly encoded ligatures due to a template that was like officially being provided by a student information organization. And once we found this out, we worked directly with them to update the template and make sure that we have a better template that's being used by students now. But I think I would explore what currently exists in your repository, because you might find that there's like one little change you could make that would make a huge difference going forward.
Had exactly the same experience. We've been working with our digital publishing specialists to come up with a template for overleaf that's more friendly to at least getting the metadata for the abstract be correct, and maybe not the whole thing, but the LaTeX has been a perpetual issue. Plus we've been scanning older BTDs that have, various, OCRing problems too. So I would love to pick anybody's brain who has ideas for dealing with that.
I think we're about at time. My first job as an undergrad was handing out the floppies for LaTeX, so people can make copies of that. So it's my fault. Thank you. It is. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the OCLC panel. Thank you very much. Saved me a spot in the lunch line. Did I say OCLC? I did.